Hello. Good. Hey, hello. Good afternoon, and welcome to everybody. It's such a great pleasure to have you here and witness these great reunions. So, let me begin. It is a tremendous pleasure for me to welcome you all to the Need for Art to Change the World, an international symposium on Gustav Metzger. Thank you for coming and being here to share with us these 3 days of prospective reflection, retrospective outlook for necessary and urgent call to provoke, expose, and discuss the fundamental theses of our societies, this in light of our world in a time of climate crisis and extinction. First of all, I would like to thank the Department of Art and Media, DKM, and especially Svetlana Heger, the head of the Department of Art and Media, for making this all-encompassing event possible. I am indebted to you, Svetlana, for your initial proposition to organize such an event and your generous invitation to all to be here and share this moment all together. And in doing so, to further the reach of a radical artist that I know you too admire. I am grateful to Laura von Niedershausen. I'm sorry for the name. I tried. I did rehearse the name, but it's long. Laura has managed with great expertise the well preparation of the symposium. Thank you for everything, Laura, too, for the hard work on making the documentation lounge and the post-exhibition a reality. I'm thankful to all at the DHDK, especially Thomas Di Meyer, the director, to Raphael Gijax, Donatella Bernardi, who unfortunately cannot be here with us tonight, and to Luca Zitzer, Sibyl Schrunriger, Judith Ricci, and André Ledwiller. I'm also very grateful to Martina Kaufmann, Sibel Kosakaya, Bernadette Kolonko, Pavle Mishuyuka for the assistance and tending to the well preparation and running of the symposium, and to Moran Zog for her work on the poster exhibition. I'm grateful to Mary Reinbold for overseeing the program handout, and to David Mami and Nicola Todeschini for its design. The symposium is organized to coincide with the release of the all-encompassing anthology Gustav Metzger Writings. Please do allow me to express my most sincere thanks to all at GRP Edition for making this book a reality, and especially to Clément Dirier, the editorial director, and Nicolas Ingener and Nicolas Lebas for designing these 700 pages, a true labor of love. I'm especially grateful to Nicolas Ingener for having first proposed the book be published as such. I'm thankful to so many for making this book possible, many of whom are here tonight. Yet please do allow me to extend my most sincere thanks to the ZHDK for the generous support. The book is available for us from now and will be throughout the symposium. So please make sure that you get a copy of yours. It is truly worth it. So the present anthology has been long in coming. I first proposed to Gustav that we begin compiling all of his published writing in the final days of 2007, a tremendous task that began in February 2008. I did not expect that this endeavor would reveal such a wealth of material and become a task that would take us to today, Thursday, the 10th of October, 2019, for this book to finally see the light. And it is for me a true honor to share this day with you all. I must confess my sadness that Gustav did not get to see it for himself today. However, he oversaw the whole process, a journey filled with incredible highs and extreme difficulties, and he approved the final form of that the publication was taken. Please do allow me to briefly introduce who Gustav was and give some biographical references. Gustav was born in Nuremberg in 1926 and passed away on the 1st of March 2017 in London, where he has lived since coming to Britain in 1939 as a refugee under the auspices of the Kindertransport, the refugee children transport, the refugee children movement. Over 10,000 children were saved from a sudden death, including, and not to diminish all others but to highlight, many who would become so influential in the fields of art, such as Frank Herbach, a fellow artist and student with Gustav, David Bomberg, celebrated an iconic artist Eva Hess, or Gustav's brother, Max Mendel. We are so indebted for those who risked everything to spare the then future, a present that shaped ours. In 1941, Gustav enrolled to become a cabinet maker in Leeds. During the war, he became interested in revolutionary politics and communism. In August 1944, Gustav was torn between becoming a professional revolutionary or an artist. To answer his own original question, Metzger became a revolutionary artist. as well as a radical theorist, philosopher, historian, and critic of our times. In early 1946, Gustav enrolled in painter David Bomber's class at the Borough Polytechnic, a class that included Auerbach, Leon Kossoff, and Anthony Hartwell. Bomber became a mentor to Gustav, a reference that Gustav would keep on coming back to throughout his life. Following over a decade of experimentation, Metzger published Autodestructive Art, his first manifesto, dated the 4th of November 1959. Please do allow me to read it. Autodestructive art is primarily a form of public art for industrial societies. Autodestructive painting, sculpture, and construction is a total unity of idea, site, form, color, method, and timing of the disintegrative process. Autodestructive art can be created with natural forces, traditional art techniques, and technological techniques. The artist may collaborate with scientists, engineers. Autodestructive art can be machine-produced and factory assembled. Autodestructive paintings, sculptures, and constructions have a lifetime varying a few moments to 20 years. When the disintegrative process is complete, the work is to be removed from the site and scrapped. The amplified sound of the autodestructive process can be an integral part of the total conception. Metzger's entire oeuvre is defined by his writing. His manifestos have been at the cornerstone of his radical and everlasting impact on art, art history, and society. Metzger wrote relentlessly and throughout his life. For him, writing was a means not only to disseminate his critical thinking, but also to make his work exist. While he embraced the ephemerality of his art, defined so often by its transient and an art too often, too frequently realized in semi-private context, it was through pamphlet, handheld, and self-publication that his work existed in the public realm and consciousness. Metzger experiments in his writing with an art of propositions, as these are the first and often the only realization of his works. The texts that form this anthology are a testimony to an artist whose vision defined and challenged the 20th century and helped to shape the 21st. Metzger's philosophy reflects on past reality, the art of the present, and challenges to the future. These writings constitute a unique account of the evolution of an artist's thinking and concerns over the course of 60 years. This book is a toolbox which will prove to be an ideal guide, even a libretto, to these 3 days of symposium to come. Please do allow me to begin introducing the symposium itself in addressing the speakers speaking in absentia. Located outside of this grosser and yet most beautiful concert salle is a documentation lounge and the exhibition of posters realized by artists Ursula Biermann, Graziella Carnevale, Cecilia Cavalieri, Ivor Davies, Svetlana Heger, Karl Almquist, Frank Lebovici, Lillian Lin, David Medalla, Gustav, Ben Morea, Phil Neblock, Karen Sender, Rikri Tiravanija, Ben Vautier, and Jacques Villeclé. Along with his historical film, Autodestructive Art, The Activities of G. Metzger, directed by Harold Liebersage in 1963, for which Gustav reenacted the acid painting action at the South Bank, the film that you can see in the documentation lounge. And along with Gustav's film from 2003, Power to the People, a timeless video produced by Kit Hammond, that could hardly be more timely as we witness the tearing apart of the European fabric on the grounds of Westminster. And I must confess that I often wonder how Gustav would respond to this senseless act of national self-destruction. Along with these, you will find 2 video conferences realized for the present symposium. The first one is a conversation that I had with Jérôme R. Ravets on the 11th of September at the Institute for Science, Innovation and Society at the University of Oxford. The basis of this conversation was to discuss the underlying implication of the Harmony Manifesto dated September 1970 that was drafted by Ravets and co-signed by Metzger, Kit Pendler, David Dixon, Robin Clark, and Peter Harper. We took the opportunity to expand upon Gustav's call for action and confront the concerns that Ravets addressed in the field of progress in science. These definitive words on the Institute for Science, Innovation and Society website encapsulate it all. To the extent that our present and sustainable material culture is a product of the ongoing industrial and technological revolution, science as it has developed is part of the problem. What would be required for science to become an integral part of the solution? What new institutions and attitudes will need to be created? This task calls for a collective effort for all those concerned with science and its future, which will be also a topic that we will come back to and address throughout these 3 days. The second conversation is with the celebrated curator and cultural mapmaker, Hans-Ulrich Obrist, that we recorded at the Serpentine Galleries in London on the 23rd of September. Together, we envisage their shared history that encompasses the 1996 exhibition Life Live at the Musée d'Art Moderne de la Ville de Paris, the 1999 exhibition Laboratorium, so indebted to Gustav's own 1968 exhibition Extreme Touch at the University College of Swansea in the Filtration Laboratory, and Gustav's 2009 retrospective at the Serpentine Galleries, an exhibition entitled Decades. And I really invite you to look at that, because it was interesting that I did not to call it a retrospective, but to call it Decades. And that exhibition was followed in October 2014 with the Extinction Marathon, Visions of the Future, programmed in collaboration with Gustav. I'm ever so grateful to both Jérôme and Hans-Ulrich for their time and their generosity in the making of these films. I invite you to take the time to listen to these, as they will surely complement our forthcoming discussions. Still in the documentation lounge and in the exhibition spaces, you will find a spoken word retrospective, Gustav Metzger, an exhibition that I curated in 2007 that presents us with a retrospective in the mind of the one who hears it through the artist's voice and words. We must invite you to listen to the soundtrack composed by Eva Meinhardt entitled Metzger Music, that will take you on a musical journey on and about destruction as interpreted by the musician and punctuated with the recordings of Lillian Lin, reading an interpretation of these words that give the title of the symposium. I will focus my concluding remarks on Saturday from 6:30 till 7, prior to the closing drink reception offered by the Department of Art and Media at the KM, to reflect upon what was discussed, of course, in these 3 days to come, but also to especially reflect upon the implication of this urgent call for action in this time of climate change and limiting extinction. Indeed, the need for art to change the world. This international symposium envisages Metzger's art, philosophy, and imperatives, auto-destructive and auto-creative art, the Destruction in Art Symposium Dias, London 1966, computer arts, the crisis in technological art, and the social responsibility of artists. I am thus so very grateful to Jonathan Benthall, Ivor Davies, F.M. Meinhardt, Catherine Mason, Norman Rosenthal, Kristine Stiles, and Andrew Wilson for all coming here to ZHDK, and I must share with you my excitement to witness these lectures and to take part in this discussion to be. I have no doubt that this shall be extremely enlightening. Please allow me to invite you to refer to the handout for a detailed program, as we will look forward to having you back over and over again these next few days. So, on Saturday, October the 12th, from 3 till 4:30, I will be in this conversation with Norman Rosenthal. This shall be followed by a roundtable with Ivor Davies, Catherine Mason, Norman Rosenthal, Kristine Stiles, and Andrew Wilson from 5 till 6:30. Tomorrow, on Friday, October the 11th, from 3 till 4:30, Catherine Masons will discuss Shouldering the Task of the Century, Gustav Metzger and Computer Art. At 5 p.m. until 6:30, Jonathan Benthall will be remembering the Zagreb Manifesto, 1969. And from 7 p.m. onwards, I will be in conversation with Andrew Wilson. As for this evening, from 7:30 through to 8:30, it will be my honor to be in conversation with Ivor Davies, who, amongst so many things that we shall envisage together, has, together with Gustav and John Sharkey, co-organized Dias, the Destruction in Art Symposium in 1966. This will be followed by the opening reception with drinks and snacks offered in the Mespur Music Club. So again, I'm sorry for the name. It's the Club of Music downstairs. As we all leave the conference hall together, please do take a pass bracelet that will entitle you to a complimentary drink and food. We shall form a procession and walk down to the basement club, where at 10 p.m., FMI Night will convene the power of destruction for the creation of his music, and take this possibility of a tabula rasa to a new level with a concert entitled Platz schaffen. Now, before having the honor to welcome and introduce our first guest, Dr. Kristine Stiles, who will begin the symposium with the most anticipated lecture, Gustav Metzger and the social implication of autodestructive art monuments today, please do allow me to read you the following statement written by Yasha Hishot, the British art critic, curator, and writer. Gustav invited Yasha to introduce his first lecture demonstration at the Temple Gallery in London on the 22nd of June, 1960. It thus seemed fitting for the introduction to the symposium dedicated to Gustav to begin with his memorial words written by Yasha following to the death of Gustav on the 1st of March 2017. Remember Gustav. In the summer of 1960, I asked Gustav, "Is your work about the past or the future?" "Neither," he said, "it is about now." And indeed, as he painted the sheets of plastic with acid, the work lived and or was dying before our eyes. At the time, he was mounting his exhibition of autodestructive paintings at the Temple Gallery in Knightsbridge, a gallery that usually showed icons. What seemed strange at the time is seen as prescient today. I introduced that exhibition, but I don't recall what I said. Had he continued to paint after attending Bomberg composition class, he would have become an expressionist painter and, in his own words, a handmaiden for the social system. He chose instead, throughout the years, to become a politician without a party, inventing and using art to proclaim his revolution. His position of being against was a subject and a slogan. It was presented compellingly enough to inspire his viewers and his audience so successfully that at a certain point, he permitted himself to retreat from the desperate stance and to make the crystal display, which he called and which really was auto-creative. I was fond of Gustav and I understood very well where his art and his idea came from, but did not feel at home when the smashed piano at the Destruction in Art Symposium, nor with his intolerance of people who think differently and who are neither warmongers or promoters of capitalism. What is important is that he leaves us with something to think about, an archive of history, as well as his last vital message, remember nature. These words of praise and criticism offer a fitting introduction to these coming 3 days. Again, a symposium under the auspices of the wealth of Gustav Metzger's writing, the powerful and far-reaching words of a radical artist, philosopher, critic, and moral compass. Please do allow me these few words that conclude the introduction to the anthology and thus open these days of calls and actions through a prospective history. Gustav's writings are a constant reminder that integrity comes at a price, and that fighting for your conviction can indeed change the world. Metzger has done more than raise awareness. His art and philosophy are a stark testimony to the alternative world for which he strove. When Metzger radically challenged what art can be in defining autodestructive art, it was equally essential for him to define auto-creative art. Destruction and creation are the two sides of the same coin. His art and memory lives on. His writings and philosophy must be disseminated and shared in order to foster his fundamental belief and his lifelong concern that we should all fight against extinction. Extinction does not have to be inevitable, and we must constantly challenge the status quo. Thank you and welcome. So,
Okay.
I'll take that away from you. So should I read who you are? I think I should. I should, just for the sake of it, because I'm sorry I don't have the paper ready. It's a great pleasure for me to begin this evening with introducing you to Kristine. So, Kristine Stiles is a French family professor of art history, and visual studies at Duke University, and holds an honorary doctorate of the arts from Dartington College of Art and the University of Plymouth in England, 2005. She's an historian of contemporary art and artist writing, and specializes in interdisciplinary experimental art, from performance to conceptual art. She has taught drama in art, literature, and film for 25 years. She's the co-author with Peter Stiles of Theories and Documents for Contemporary Art, University of California Press, 1996 and 2012. Her latest book is Concerning Consequences, Studies in Art, Destruction and Trauma, University of Chicago Press, 2016. Stiles also edited, annotated, and wrote the Survey for Correspondence course and Epistolary History of Karl Schneemann and a Circle, Duke University Press, 2010, and is the author of Rafael Montanez Ortiz, Years of the Warrior, Years of the Psyche, 1968-1988, at Museo del Barrio in 1988. Among many others, artists cataloged the monograph-length essay Uncorrupted to Joy, International Art Action for the exhibition Out of Actions Between Performance and the Object, 1949-1979. And amongst, great, I love them. Amongst many other exhibitions, Stiles has curated Rauschenberg Collecting and Connecting, 2014-15, and State of Mind, Diane and Leah Perzovich, 2007, at the National Museum of Art at Duke University, and John Tosh, Impression for the Rogue Bush Imperial Presidency at the John Hope Franklin Center, Duke University, 2009. She advises major museums in the US and abroad on collections and exhibitions. Kristine is a preeminent researcher and writer on Davies since as early as 1976, and in 1980 went to Frankfurt, where Gustav lived, to first interview him about Davies for a 1987 doctoral dissertation at the University of California, Berkeley, the first scholarly examination of the Destruction in Art Symposium. Please do join me in welcoming to the stage for this much anticipated opening lecture, Kristine. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Mathieu for the invitation to participate in this auspicious conference and to acknowledge Laura van Neerholzener from the Zurich University of the Arts for her gracious assistance in all aspects of my visit. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to think anew about Gustav Metzger, whose life and work have occupied me for some 40 years. A long relationship like ours ebbed and flowed and certainly had its highs and lows. Therefore, I'm particularly grateful for this opportunity to unite with Gustav. Let me begin with the preface. At the end of 1988, during the darkest last years of the Romania's totalitarian regime, when the population suffered extreme deprivation from erratic electricity to scarcity of food, when a humiliated populace could find only a tomato, a potato, a bit of pork, bitter tea, and wine tainted by the 1986 fallout from Chernobyl, this dire situation honed the Romanians' notoriously fine sense of humor. Here is an example of a classical joke of the period. A woman walks into the butcher's store and smiles brightly and asks to purchase a steak. The two butchers look at their empty counter and politely respond, "We apologize, madam, but we don't have any steak." Undaunted and remaining cheerful, the lady proceeds to ask for a rib, then a lamb chop, then some ham, then she moves on to fish, and so on. With each request, the butchers again respond with apologies. Realizing that the butchers have nothing to sell, she leaves with a jaunty farewell. One butcher looks at the other and shakes his head. "Whew, she's so crazy." The other butcher sighs. "Yes, but what a memory." I tell this joke, it's not so funny really, about extreme hardship and its relation to memory, because tonight I will think about Gustav Metzger's memory, his traumatic memory. For when confronted with overwhelming social, political, and cultural devastation, Metzger resisted being shattered and insisted upon remembering. This, despite profound emotional pain, anguish that longed to be forgotten. Yet he marshaled the audacity to live in goodwill and to continue to create while pursued by the Holocaust. Tonight, I will suggest that Metzger's traumatic memory might be understood to have been embodied in three aspects of his work: demonstrating, sublimating, and transmogrifying. I isolate these periods in his thought in this three-part presentation, which is an hour long, as I was requested to do, which will be followed by questions. I isolate these periods in order to unpack my underlying thesis. It is this: although Metzger never ostensibly abandoned his revolutionary concept of destruction in art, he sensed, at least by the 1980s, if not before, that the time for destruction in art and society had passed. In the radically altered contemporary global world in which social and political violence and the destruction of nature is ubiquitous. This, my basic premise, is grounded in an essay that Metzger delivered in a talk in 1992 entitled, quote, "Nature Demised Resurrects as Environment," end quote, to which I shall turn in part 3 of this presentation. Further, with regards to my fundamental premise, I will conclude that when destruction invades every aspect of society throughout the world, as it does today, destruction in art is not only redundant, it is insensitive and injudicious. Part 1. Gustav Metzger dated his first manifesto, Autodestructive Art, November 9, 1959. He wrote this 21 years to the day after Kristallnacht, the infamous nationwide attack on Jews and Jewish property throughout Germany, which began on the evening of November 9, 1938, and lasted into the following day. In the interviews I conducted with Metzger in 1980, while still a graduate student, he repeatedly emphasized the temporal period of some 20 years between his radical conception of autodestructive art in 1959 and being sent, as we've learned, to England in 1939 on a Kindertransport. Autodestructive art, whatever else it became, was for Gustav Metzger a proxy for the legacy of these staggering events that forever altered his life. As most here know, Metzger identified autodestructive art as machine-produced, factory-assembled public art. It's very important that we emphasize public art for industrial societies. Autodestruction would depend upon natural elements such as erosion, but it could also be augmented by internal computers as set at different lengths of time. Metzger symbolically stipulated the period to be a few minutes to 20 years, namely the 20 years since 1939, between 1939 and 59, when he was sent to England. Autodestructive art was to be installed in urban settings where the moment of its self-destruction might be volatile or go unnoticed, but it would always be unpredictable. In this manner, ADA, we'll call it that from now on, would thereafter serve as a perpetual public reminder of the potential for imminent annihilation, as we must understand Kristallnacht was for him. Metzger experienced Kristallnacht in Nürnberg, the city in which he was born. He recalled the violence toward the Jews, the devastation of property, and how the Nazis fanned hatred among the rioting populace that, quote, burned synagogues and ransacked homes, ours included, he added for emphasis. To shine a sharper light on Metzger's experience, which is also well known to many in this audience, let me juxtapose him as a victim with a perpetrator, namely Joseph Beuys. Beuys remembered Kristallnacht in the German town of Kleve on the border of Holland where he grew up. Beuys explained that despite his parents' disapproval, he had voluntarily joined the Hitler Youth several years before membership was mandatory, and that he had, quote, no scruples about his decision. That said, Beuys never discussed the role that he had or may have played in Kristallnacht when the Hitler Youth of Kleve helped to destroy the city's venerable 17th century synagogue, burning it to the ground. Asked in 1982 about the situation for Jews in Kleve at the time, Beuys responded, quote, yes, I remember one or two cases of the Jews on the so-called Kristallnacht, when the synagogue was burned. After that, a couple of students were taken from school. They smelled the roast early enough and went to America. Die haben den Braten früh gerochen, die sind nach Amerika gegangen. End quote. Boy's reference to the Holocaust as a roast insinuates his disdain for the plight of the Kliva Jews, who suffered the humiliation depicted in this infamous anti-Semitic school book titled "Trust No Fox on His Green Heath and No Jew on His Oath." Published by Stürmer Verlag in Nuremberg in 1936, the book was widely distributed by the Nazis and visualized precisely what happened during Metzger's and Boy's school years. Jewish children and their Jewish teachers were expelled, Jewish businesses were ruined, and records prove that hundreds of Jews from Kliva and its surrounding villages were rounded up to die in death camps. It is no comfort that the virulent anti-Semitic editor of the book, Julius Streicher, was hanged in Nuremberg in 1946. Metzger and Boy's lives overlapped in many ways, as Norman Rosenthal rightly observed in a 1999 essay when he wrote that, quote, "In an English context, Metzger played a discreet but nevertheless immensely powerful role, as significant and farsighted as that of Joseph Beuys in Germany," end quote. Exploring these roles a bit further, one can glimpse something of the manifestations of traumatic memory in the art of the perpetrator and the victim. To begin, Beuys was 5 years older than Metzger, being born in May of 1921. Metzger was born in April of 1926. Metzger was 12 during Kristallnacht, Beuys was 17. Beuys attended the 1936 Nazi rally in Nuremberg as a member of the Hitler Youth. He no doubt was among the mass of Hitler Youth presenting the Sieg Heil salute in this photograph. Metzger knew these rallies from the age of 7, when in 1933, they became an annual event in Nuremberg. Pondering this photograph from 1933, one can only imagine the overwhelming numbers of Nazis as ultimately terrifying. Yet Metzger would later describe the parades and martial displays that he witnessed as, quote, "darkly seductive," end quote. His sense of their smoldering eroticism is confirmed in Leni Riefenstahl's 1935 gripping film, Triumph of the Will, pictured here. Ruminating further on the impact of the Nuremberg rallies, Metzger mused, quote, "It could be that I saw so much power that I needed to get rid of it in myself." That's one way to understand the origins of autodestructive art. In Judaism, there is a tradition of rejecting power. The prophets rejected power. That was part of my childhood, giving up rather than acquiring, end quote. The existential residue of Kristallnacht in Metzger was pervasive during my first interview with him in Frankfurt, Germany in 1980. He wanted the discussion to be private, and so we talked in the cramped quarters of the little room in which he was residing at the time. I sat in a chair, Metzger, looking very tiny and fragile, but with an indomitable will, sat on the edge of his bed, his knees nearly touching mine. He spoke in his customary near whisper, such that one had to lean in to hear him. It was uncomfortable, a rarefied experience, infused with the heavy, heavy weight of the continuity of historical time. Metzger offered vivid memories of his life and home. Especially notable was his description of the curtain that could be drawn in the family's living room to separate them from his father's kosher import business. Metzger oddly told me that he compared the closing of the curtain when customers would come in with a happening. And in this way, he transformed this ritual, I think, into a quasi-experience that helped him distance himself from the intimacy and vulnerability of his childhood home by metamorphosing it in the future into art. Despite the levity of that remark, he thought it was very funny. The context of Kristallnacht remained foremost in our discussion. I know, he explained, that psychologists have and I'm quoting him now, that psychologists have defined this experience of Kristallnacht as something which never, never, never leaves you. And then there was my separation from my parents. They took my father in 1938 and my sisters. They were quite simply marched off, you know, in the street. The Nazis came to our flat and asked for my father. And I had the unhappy duty of fetching him. He was at the synagogue. I was told by my mother, go and ask your father to come home. Of course, she didn't know what was going to happen, end quote. To this wrenching confession of having unwittingly surrendered his father to the Gestapo, I could only comment, you must have felt tremendous guilt. That's right, he answered. It shaped my life, which could have been very, very different, and this is at the center. He continued. So I had to fetch him, and before I came home, I saw a column of Jews, maybe 100, with guards of the NS in uniform, or perhaps they were the SS, marching to the railroad station. This was the last time I saw my father, end quote. Metzger's father and two sisters were sent, quote, to the Polish border and put in some temporary camp. That's where they stayed, he added. Then he continued. But what happened a few weeks later is that we were sent for, Metzger's mother and Metzger himself. Continuing to quote, it happened in two stages. We were picked up, put in a local prison, and the next day sent to Poland. The Poles stopped us at the border. Thousands of Jews were sent to Poland, but the Poles wouldn't let us in, so we came back, which is something we should be thankful for. We came back to our home, and my mother realized the impossible. My brother and I were sent to England on the Kindertransport, organized by the big English Jewish organization, and it was just like clockwork. My mother sold what we had, or got rid of it, and she went to a camp, voluntarily at that point. She was alone in Germany and wanted to go to that camp where she met my sisters and my father. My sisters managed to leave Poland through Sweden and come to England. So that was that. And then, of course, the war comes. End quote. But as it turns out, that was not that. For Metzger then continued to narrate the demise of his family. Quote, my grandparents were in fact destroyed by the Nazis. My eldest brother lived with my grandparents, who were all taken away from Strasbourg during the war and killed. First there was the war, and then there is the end of it, the very end of it with Hiroshima. At this point, Metzger abruptly shifts focus from the Holocaust to the atomic and hydrogen bombs dropped by the United States on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, when he was 19. Quote, the atomic bomb is really the starting point of my work, he insisted. Quote, this is the point when I was an art student, and I was very, very conscious that from now on, everything was different, including art. From that point, I started to probe the limits of art, of what one could do and what one had to do in relation to society, in relation to helping society, so this couldn't happen again, end quote. Metzger's emphasis on my own work in this sentence, it is as if the sudden but distant exposure to the bomb released him from the closer impact of the Holocaust. An observation I will pick up in part 2 of this talk. Metzger repeated this narrative throughout his life. 29 years after my interview with him, he told the Guardian critic Jonathan Jones in 2009 that autodestructive art was, quote, a summing up of my entire life until that period. It was my childhood in Nazi Germany, coming to this country in England as a refugee, as a survivor, and then when we had peace, the entire planet being transformed by nuclear weapons. This is the center of my life, end quote. To repeat, in 1939, that was the year Metzger was sent on the Kindertransport to England. That's the same year World War II commenced with Hitler's invasion of Poland on September 1st. Boys immediately volunteered for military service, although he had not been conscripted. And he was trained as a radio operator. While boys served Hitler, Metzger became increasingly interested in politics. About age 17, around 1942 or 43, he stated, that's when it occurred. Initially, he imagined becoming, quote, some sort of revolutionary figure for whom art would have no place in my conception of the future, end quote. That view changed, quote, in the late summer of 1944, end quote, when he realized that, quote, one could fuse the political ideal of social change with art and not simply through political economic activity alone, end quote. Not long after Metzger's decision to move into art in early 1945, Boys was captured by the British and placed in a British prisoner of war camp for a few months. He was eventually released and returned to Kleve. What Boys actually did in the war is unclear and open to much speculation, as probably everyone here knows. But it would appear that his wartime service was wide-ranging and extensive. According to his own biographical notes, dated October 1961, entitled Notenzettel. There, Boys recorded his, quote, important impressions, end quote, including what he saw in the Slav lands, namely Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Moravia, before moving on to Russia, the Nogay steppes, and their surrounding seas and numerous cities. Next, he lists the Crimea, where he was hospitalized after the Stuka plane, in which he was a radio operator and perhaps a gunner, crashed. He seems to have been considered recovered enough after hospitalization to move back to the Eastern European front, as he next cites as important impressions Romania, Croatia, and the Sava River, all places of extreme violent conflict. Next, he lists Hungary, Vienna, and Apulia in southern Italy, and he concludes in the Western theater of war as a paratrooper in North Holland, Oldenburg to the North Sea coast. If Boy's account of his military service is true, it was highly unusual. According to Christopher Browning, the renowned Holocaust historian, specialist on Nazi military procedures, and authors of such books as Ordinary Men, Reserve Police Battalion 101, and The Final Solution in Poland. I interviewed Browning in 1998, questioning him about what kind of military position Boys may have held that enabled such fluid movement throughout the war. Browning mused, quote, Boys was either just an ordinary soldier of the Third Reich whose obvious need for self-aggrandizement and attention shaped his fantastical autobiographical constructions, or he had participated in activities which needed to be hidden, end quote. Boys entered the Dusseldorf Kunstakademie in 1949 and seldom spoke about his state of mind, recorded in this remarkable 1950 photograph, an image that bears witness to his psychological fragility and the nervous breakdown he had following the war. Haunted by the monstrosities of the war that he had witnessed or in which he had participated, Boys depicted many disturbing images in the early 1950s, like this drawing on the far side of Demons from 1951, and like the misogynistic images he created of women, such as this untitled watercolor and collage of 1958, which depicts a female figure, arms bound and legs splayed, between which Boys collaged the figure of a hare. As the hare was Boys' personal symbol, this and other similar representations of women during the period raised the question of what Boys meant when he said, and I quote, I am a hare, a horny hare, end quote, and how and if these images might be traumatic memories of his wartime life. Boys eventually recovered from his psychological crisis with the help of his first collector and longtime friend, Hans van der Gritten, who told me in an interview in 2001 that Boys would not eat or leave his room for days on end. He became anorexic and required physical intervention and serious psychological treatment, end quote. Artist Otto Pina, a classmate of Boys in the Dusseldorf Art Academy, explained to me also in 2001 that, quote, Boys had bouts with insanity or something like that and would go and get treatment, remaining out of view for a while, end quote. Gunter Grass, too, was a classmate of Boys and described the artist in his book Beim Hauten der Zwiebel, Peeling the Onion, of 2006 as, quote, a holy fool who was considered a genius though he was merely a pupil of Ivor Matare, end quote. Grass added, quote, I was no longer eager to study with Matare, who had adopted the ascetic Christianity, even anthroposophical trappings of this then dominant pupil, Joseph Beuys, end quote. Grass concludes his comments on Beuys by sarcastically commenting, quote, who would have thought he would later occasion a precipitous rise in the price of artificial honey and various fats and felts, end quote. As Beuys continued to struggle to heal, Metzger thrived, writing extensively, developing painting with acid, participating in the famous Committee of 100 along with such luminaries as Bertrand Russell, calling for nuclear disarmament. Metzger also flirted with Fluxus briefly, participating in the Festival of Misfits at Gallery 1 in 1962 in London, where the participants were each dubbed with a satirical name, Metzger's being the escaped Jew. Metzger's contribution to the Misfits exhibition was to have been to display the front page of the daily newspaper. His proposition became even more compelling when in the midst of the Misfits Festival, the Cuban Missile Crisis began October 14th, only ending October 28th. Metzger's proposal was rejected as not art. I think that's very funny. And especially by the Fluxus artists. And his brief flirtation with Fluxus never seemed to be revived. Metzger was always interested in science, technology, kinetics, and biokinetics, which his paintings on acid augured, and his involvement in signals was significant. Then in collaboration with one of our very important speakers here, and John Sharkey, Ivor Davies and John Sharkey, he mounted the historic month-long event, the Destruction Art Symposium, which included exhibitions, performances, and a 3-day symposium, all of which took place during the month of September in London, 1966. What few people know is that this magnificent month-long event was followed by a trial of Metzger and Sharkey at the Old Bailey in London for having unlawfully caused to be shown a lewd and indecent exhibition, namely the action performed by Hermann Nietzsche's Orchis Mystery Theater. Metzger had invited Beuys to participate in Davies and recalled that, and I'm quoting Metzger, quote, Beuys refused on the grounds that he did not sanction destruction in art or in any other arena of human endeavor, end quote. I learned in a letter from Eva Beuys in 1986 that she could find no letters relating to Davies in Beuys' collection. 8 years later, in 1974, Metzger and Beuys were both included in the Art into Society, Society into Art, 7 German artists at the Institute of Contemporary Arts in London. Quote, the irony and ambiguity of Metzger participating, albeit reluctantly, in a German exhibition, Norman Rosenthal, a co-organizer of the event, Riley commented, quote, was not lost on all of us. No doubt Metzger's subsequent call for artists to withdraw from art making for 3 years, from 1977 to 80, was in some ways his form, I think, of his resistance or recovery from his participation with the Germans. 2 years earlier, on February 25th, 1972, Metzger had challenged Beuys during Beuys' information action at the Tate. Countering Beuys' theory of, quote, sculpture as an evolutionary process, everyone an artist, Metzger exposed the romantic fiction of such rhetoric by notoriously and aggressively asking Beuys publicly, everyone an artist? Himmler too? Closer to Beuys' thinking, I believe, than Himmler would have been Joseph Goebbels, master propagandist of German culture during the most formidable period of Beuys' life. For it was Goebbels who first claimed, quote, politics is the plastic art of the state, end quote. This would be a theme of Beuys, as we probably all here know. It was Goebbels who wrote in his 1929 novel, Michael, renowned throughout Nazi Germany, the following, quote, the artist differs from the non-artist in his ability to express what he feels in some form or another. One artist does it in painting, another in clay, a third in words. and a fourth in marble or even historical forms. I'm continuing quoting Goebbels. The statesman is also an artist. For him, the nation is exactly what the stone is for the sculptor. Führer and masses, that is as little a problem to say as painter and color, end quote. To wit, in 1991, Beuys told Hans Meyer, quote, "My way went through language, strange as it is. It did not start from the so-called pictorial gift," end quote. Although there is much more to say, we must leave Beuys with his language and give Metzger the last word in the form of one of his historic photographs, works to which we will eventually turn. In this particular work, Metzger obscured a picture of Hitler Youth, welding them between sheets of steel and tilting the whole thing, and titling the whole thing Hitler Youth Welded In, or more sarcastically, Shrink Wrapped. One could say that Metzger borrowed the steel that Beuys used and shut the loquacious Hitler Youth up. Part 2, sublimating. Metzger's second manifesto, dated 10 March 1960, began by indicting, quote, man on Regent Street as autodestructive, along with, quote, rockets and nuclear weapons which reenact the obsession with destruction, the pummeling to which individuals and the masses are subjected, end quote. Through the reenactment of destruction that Metzger expounded in his manifesto, he committed art as a symbolic remedy to social and environmental destruction. In other words, performing the very destruction and annihilation he abhorred. This tautology resides at the core of destruction in art, as much as it is also enmeshed in how Metzger displaced what he called atomic physics for the Holocaust as the worst thing that happened in the 20th century. In his words, making, quote, Eichmann Land a fairy tale playground, end quote. In such a statement, Metzger seems to have substituted his own emotional suffering for intellectual discourse and activism opposing the nuclear age, thereby transmogrifying Eichmann, a principal architect of the mass deportations camps, into a kind of fantasy. In this very real sense, however urgent the issues of the nuclear age were and remain, the atomic bomb, I think, functioned for Metzger as something akin to what is known in the operations of trauma studies as a screen memory. Namely, the atomic bomb was a representation that owes its value as memory not to its own content, but to the relation existing between that content and some other matter that's suppressed, namely the Holocaust. It's easier to think about the bomb for Metzger, I believe, than it was the Holocaust. What I propose is that Metzger's term atomic physics serve Metzger as a shield, distancing him from the originating trauma and enabling him through a kind of dissociation to condense and displace the anguish of the Shoah in and onto the political challenges of the nuclear age. Nevertheless, all the while, he presented himself as what Rosenthal again described as, quote, the eternal refugee, a symbolic individual, end quote. Metzger was indeed a symbol for the Holocaust, and also not symbolic because, quite simply, he actually embodied the displaced person. In the most literal sense, he was a witness to and a victim of the Holocaust, residing in the interstice between traumatic experience and memory. In thinking more carefully about the location of traumatic memory, we could do no better than to listen to Dr. Dori Laub, who famously understood and described the psychic reality and behavior of trauma in victims of the Holocaust. Recently deceased, Dr. Laub was the distinguished Israeli-American psychiatrist, expert in Holocaust testimony methodology, and co-founder of the Fortunoff Video Archive of Holocaust Testimonies and Yale's Genocide Studies program. Laub described the Holocaust, and he, by the way, was a Holocaust survivor himself. Laub described the Holocaust, quote, as an event without a witness, meaning explicitly a witness in the psychological sense of the word. What Laub meant by this insight is that as a result of always already being inside the event, one loses the capacity to witness to oneself. And thus, to witness from the outside is perhaps the true meaning of annihilation. For when one's history is abolished, one's identity ceases to exist at all. What I've just described to you is what is the experience of Holocaust survivors. And I'm suggesting that this was also Metzger's experience. Laub continued, quote, because the event that had no witness to its truth essentially did not exist, and thus signified its own death and its own reduction to silence, any instance of its survival inevitably implied the presence of some sort of informal discourse, of some degree of unconscious witnessing that could not find its voice or its expression during the event. So I'm suggesting that autodestruction is an expression of what he experienced during the event that had no other voice. Witnessing, Laub continues, cannot occur during the event, which is what accounts for its radical otherness, as there is, quote, no current knowing or assimilation of the history of the occurrence, end quote, Laub. This phenomenological aspect of trauma also begins to explain the belated manifestations of trauma in individual consciousness, where it generally appears long after the event takes place. This belated confrontation with the originating trauma may be the case with Metzger, as we shall now see, and it may account for his comment that autodestructive art exists only in the mind. It is often repeated that after he declared a hiatus of making art between 1977 and 1980, Metzger, quote, pulled himself out of the London scene during the 80s and was slowly forgotten until 1993. This claim is inaccurate and a myth of the artist. For Metzger, in fact, remained active, researching and writing. In late middle age, he obsessively consulted documents and images related to the Holocaust, confronting them directly long after his initial trauma. This preoccupation resulted most notably in his unforgettable series, Historic Photographs, of 1996 to 98. We can view these visual works as a repercussion of traumatic dissociative memory that arrived full-blown later in his life, as if shrouded until he was prepared to engage and surmount it. Then, what is of singular significance is this: when he addressed the Holocaust directly, he still cloaked and covered and veiled many of the unbearable photographs. There, the images could only be partially seen behind iron plates, wooden barriers, brick walls, and tarps. He even welded an image closed, as we learned in the steel encasement of the Hitler Youth photograph. To crawl into Anschluss, Vienna, March 1938, that you see someone crawling under the tarp there on the far screen. He required visitors to crawl on the floor under a tarp, covering a huge photograph of Viennese Jews forced to scrub street pavements. Creeping along under the enlarged photograph in the claustrophobic semi-dark on the floor, one found oneself confronted literally on the ground with suffering, humiliation, and certain death. In these installation decisions, I propose that Metzger reproduced for and in the viewer traumatic memory by means of metonymic replacement. For he literally required us to reenact traumatic dissociation by partly obscuring and crawling and struggling to discover that which remained partially inaccessible and unknowable. Indeed, in a 1998 interview with Andrew Wilson, Metzger explained that he had obscured the photograph because, quote, when confronted with nothing, it is difficult to find one's bearings. This is the state in which I seek to place the viewer, end quote. In a particularly sensitive review of Metzger's historic photographs, Alison Jones described Metzger as, quote, a man who lives in a perpetual state of night and fog, end quote. While this is an evocative description, clearly referring to Alain René's 1956 film of the liberation of German concentration camps, it might be remembered that the weight of the phrase night and fog belonged to Hitler, whose 1941 directive, Nacht und Nebel, targeted political activists and resistant workers to be imprisoned or killed. These people disappeared into night and fog, never to be heard from again. In this context, I think we must be careful to give credit to Metzger's heroic life, recognizing him as a commanding survivor who did not become a shade of night and fog. At the same time, the body of historic photographs is the most explicit work, in my view, that he ever created on the Holocaust, which came, I said, at middle and late age. And it could be said that he constantly warded off its death immersion and death anxiety significantly through the production earlier of auto-destructive art. Equally remarkable in his comparatively few attempts to promote and develop auto-creative art, very few times did he really address auto-creative art. But when he did, one can see that what's being paired is Thanos, the primitive impulse of destruction, decay, and death in auto-destructive art, with Eros, or the opposing life instinct. In this sense, Metzger seemed to have attempted to find an equilibrium between the simultaneously counterposed positions of Eros and Thanatos, the life and the death instincts. In this end, I think the effort eluded him. For Metzger's entire life was burdened with survivor guilt, the contradictions, numbing, search for meaning, and moral dilemma of the survivor who can never completely screen out what is emotionally insupportable. Indeed, as trauma studies widely suggest, victims may even perceive themselves as perpetrators, the one responsible for the atrocity, because he or she could not intervene in or stop the destruction. Neither could they rescue another victim. This last is true for Metzger. The son, involuntarily responsible, delivered his father to the Nazi death machine, which ultimately augured autodestructive art, itself machine-produced and factory-assembled for industrial societies. Part 3, transmogrifying. At this sober junction, I take up Metzger's emotional essay, Nature Demised Resurrects as Environment, which ends with the following statement, quote, not knowing is a form of erasure. This is, of course, what I've been talking about. It is very different from not having. These are Metzger's words. Not knowing is a form of erasure. It is very different from not having, end quote. Metzger's emphasis on erasure reinforces much of what we have just discussed, specifically that when one is a being inside an event of trauma, one loses the capacity to be a witness to oneself. This loss of self is the true meaning of annihilation insofar as one's identity ceases to exist as well. Even here, when autodestructive art and the nuclear age converge with and/or transfigure into the looming crisis of nature, erasure is the profound core of the message. In Nature Demised Resurrects as Environment, Metzger uses the word demise to indicate that nature is terminated. Rather than return to the word destruction, Metzger underscores nature's expiration and passing. This death is due, he writes, to the human-imposed notion of environment. Environment that causes, quote, the smoke humanity has put on nature. That is quite a statement. This is a formidable and arresting assertion. For the smoke humanity has put on nature poetically underscores the pathos of the murder of nature by smoke created by humanity. Metzger's use of the Metzger of smoke has far-reaching implications, for smoke is the visible suspension of the carbon residue of burning bodies. Smoke is the plume rising after the bomb drops. The smoke humanity has put on nature is prescient of this our present moment too. If one smells the cinders of fires raging now in Indonesia, or the thousands of homes smoked in California fires last year, the result of the exploitation of nature, think too of the smoke humanity put on the ancient lungs of the planet, aflame in the Amazon, a result of deforestation. In short, all this smoke adds up to erasure of the planet. As such, Metzger's smoke is as current today as it was in 1992 when he wrote this essay, and this is to say nothing of the resonance of smoke in his art and the smoke trails throughout his life. We will turn now to the preface of Nature Demise Resurrects as Environment. It begins with a long walk up to the castle of Neuschwanstein in southern Bavaria and ends in an afterword with an American cathedral in New York City. With these two examples, Metzger insinuates the alpha and omega of all this smoke is probably the Germans, the Americans, and Christianity. In his preface, he writes that one is, quote, within minutes of reaching the gigantic castle of Neuschwanstein, but cannot see it for being surrounded on every side in every direction by trees enormously tall, end quote. Perhaps nowhere else in Europe, he adds, quote, is the stark contrast between nature and environment, man-made construction. That's his way of talking about environment, a word he did not want, he uses only in the negative. It is the stark contrast between nature and environment, man-made construction, so extreme as here. There is nothing to mediate between them, end quote. In his afterword, Metzger turns to the Church of St. John the Divine in New York City as, quote, one of the largest cathedrals in the world. There, he tells us, plans are afoot to complete a building with, quote, a glass roof that will include a bioshelter for about 40 living trees. The impression will be a green cross by day while offering a crystalline shimmer from within at night. He concludes, quote, in the 100 years since the creation of the castle of Neuschwanstein, a circle has been completed. There, the seemingly endless vistas of tall trees and hills have an overpowering effect. In New York, the cathedral offers shelter to the bedraggled remnants of a rout. He uses the word rout, R-O-U-T, which specifically means total collapse, surrender, and massacre. With its biocenter, the cathedral celebrates piously and with restraint the triumph of man over nature, a central tenet of the church, and a concept that is at the heart of Western civilization, end quote. Between the bookends of German fantasies, Americans' grandiosity, and the historical violence of Christianity, Metzger's essay reads as a summation of a lifetime of destruction ending with the environment, a term he explains that, quote, lends itself perfectly to telling lies and giving illusions, for how it, quote, hides, confuses the public, and distorts their perceptions of reality, end quote. In place of the word environment, which hides its destruction in its smoke, Metzger asks that we speak of damaged nature, a phrase that became a touchstone for him the rest of his life. But the essay does not end here. He relentlessly continues, quote, reflection on nature now is a dirge. We circle a forest now, not with anticipation of the awe that we once experienced when we enter it, but with the uncertainty, or with the certainty, that we shall observe circles of hell that have scarred it in innumerable places, end quote. Several pages on, Metzger adds, the entire development of art is indivisibly fused with nature and with concepts of nature. Poetry is shuttered in nature. Leaving the arts, he inevitably returns to technology and capitalism. Quote, damage the environment, okay, and then repair it, clean. Clean it up, change your technology, a viable path into the future, like radiation from a nuclear reactor at point of no return. The ozone layer, the greenhouse effect, entered the equation and stands like Chernobyl before the world as a warning, and worse, as an uncontrollable event that can bring it all down. Damage to the forest came like a bomb. It's not just nature that is wiped out, it is our memory that is overturned. With the overturn of memory, we arrive at the convergence of trauma and tragedy in Metzger's life. As we move towards my conclusion, let me then turn our thoughts to the words of the German philosopher Gustav Metzger as he considers the distinguishing features of tragedy. Metzger draws our attention to the family destiny of Oedipus, which, quote, determines the course of his life from before its beginning until even after his death, end quote. Quote, Oedipus's life is not comprised in a fate, Metzger tells us. On the contrary, fate does not enter life because, quote, fate is internal to life. It begins and ends within this one life, which is also why, as Metzger observes, quote, it is inexplicable in terms of this one life, end quote. Fate is what is being, quote, done, what one does, how one acts that brings on the tragedy. And in its daunting twists, what brings about one's misfortune is how one aims at avoiding the very misfortune in question, end quote. Then, quoting Hungarian literary scholar and philologist Péter Zondi, Metzger adds, quote, what is tragic is not annihilation as such, but rather that deliverance turns into annihilation. It is not the hero's downfall in which tragedy takes place, but rather in the ruin with which a human being is met on the very path he or she entered in order to escape from ruin. If we follow Zondi's logic, it is deeply ironical that destruction in art is the very path Metzger chose in his escape from the ruin that altered his life so tragically. In this regard, as much as he is celebrated today as a heroic figure, the, quote, conscience of the art world, as some have written, he's also a man unable to escape his fate, regardless of his work as an artist and social thinker. Having said all this, as we acknowledge Metzger as a key figure to explore destruction in art, we must consider that he also implicitly counseled that the time for destruction had passed with the exponential increase in destruction in our time. Metzger himself issued this dire warning in his essay, Nature Demised Resurrects as Environments, that I've been quoting from, but also in a comment he made in 2009. In closing, let us listen to Metzger one last time. In an interview with Emma Ridgway on of all days, November 9th, 2009, the propitious date in 1938 and 38, with which I began and now end this talk, but which Ridgway nor Metzger remarked on in their interview. Very strange for Metzger not to say something about November 9th. Ridgway states that while attending exhibitions with Metzger from time to time, she had several times observed that he had been disinterested in the work because it lacked political bite or ethical aspect. Then she asked him, is this something you feel artists' work must contain? Metzger responded, I think that it is inescapable. And the more the world is changing in the direction of more speed and more activities, the more that happens, the more necessary it is for people to stand back, and not merely in the art sphere, but in every sphere of intellectual activity, to stand back and distance oneself and come up with alternative ways of dealing with reality, than going along with a direction that is essentially catastrophic and consuming itself, where technology seems to be unstoppable. And the more it goes on, the more we need to stand aside and distance ourselves from this rush towards destruction. Thank you.
welcome questions. How's
Okay,
that for a few
okay.
minutes?
Sure.
I think that was so dense and there's so much to unpack, unravel. Thank you. Thank you so much for such a wonderful talk. I've been waiting for a long time for that to happen, so I'm delighted that he came. Thank you. I think the question that I had throughout your presentation, which would somehow we'll address obviously with Ivor afterwards, but throughout the discussion that you had in the 80s with all the members that took place in the Destruction in Art Symposium, was it a pattern that came out through many of the participants in the symposium then? That trauma, that initial trauma that you found about, was it something that really came back?
That's a very important question. I have to say that when I did my doctoral research, I had not studied trauma at all. I was simply attracted to destruction in art, which I later found out why, because of trauma. But I did not think about it at all at that time. And so when I met almost everyone and interviewed them, it never came up in my questions. It was never a part of the discussion. And it wasn't really until the late 80s and early 90s that I started working on trauma. And I've been teaching about it ever since. So it was not part. But one of the things that led me to work on it on trauma was that once I had encountered discussions of it and its operations and so forth, then I realized that almost everyone in Davies had some trauma. Almost. I'm not going to say everyone, but almost everyone.
Right.
I mean, for example, Ortiz and being a huge Puerto Rican American in New York City and its racism and on and on. So it was very interesting in that regard for me to observe after the fact. I'd already finished my dissertation.
That's fascinating. Yes, because this is really something that one can see from the iconography that was used anyhow through it all. And of course, the Viennese Actionists, whether that would have been something that was striking to the, of ultimate presence. So that was interesting to me to hear. Thank you. Thank you. I love your joke about the
Romanian joke?
Oh, no, that one was a tough one. No, I was more going to go for the Festival of Misfits.
Oh, yeah.
And the reason why, because I'm always fascinated to such extent that Gustav really pushed the limits of many people around him. And I really love the idea that he would push Daniel Squeri and Robert Filiu's limit.
You know who canceled? He wouldn't let him. It was Filiu.
Yeah.
And Robert Filiu is the most generous human soul when he was on Earth there could be. And I asked him about it.
Right.
And he said he was desperately ashamed of himself and he apologized. But he said, he made that mistake. He couldn't see it as art at that point.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was speaking with Daniel Squeri a few weeks ago, trying to really scrap back some memories of that moment too. And that was the same comment that Daniel was telling me as well, that this was not art, this was not serious, this could not be art.
If you look at the constructions inside of the Misfits Festival, it all looked like Metzgers.
Well, yeah, that's what I love, that picture where he is the misfits when it comes to that.
The misfit.
And that pushed things too far. Squeri was telling me, I don't think people would have understood. And he kept on repeating that, which was quite interesting, that such a simple constraint, which was the use of newspaper, which had been such an important job for Gustav anyway. For him, the newspaper was about this is now, this is the present, and this is something that we all share, would be something that would be too far for the general public to grasp. However, what was the general public of Gallery 1? But great space for experimentation, as we know and can see. Now, I have a very, maybe to go back to the beginning, is what brought you to Gustav's work and Davies in general?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. I love to answer it. Oh, it's a wonderful question. I love to answer. I had just finished my master's degree at Berkeley on surrealism. And I realized that I was at the end of something that doesn't end. Surrealism doesn't end. And it's so powerful as a practice in those days and still as a theoretical idea and so on. And so I didn't know what else to do for my dissertation. And so I went to the library and I spent days and days and days just looking through art magazines. And then I saw this picture, and it was of Ortiz, actually, it was this giant man sitting in a chair on the edge of the sea, and you saw a great expanse of beach, and then the man with his back to the camera and a great expanse of sea, and then he stood up and destroyed the chair, and then he piled the chair up, and I just was blown away by that. I thought to myself, and this also goes back to traumatic things, he's telling some kind of profound truth. I didn't put it in the context of trauma, I put it in the context of truth at that time. And I thought, I have to pursue, this is the truth. I have to pursue this truth. And I kept turning the pages, and of course it was the special issue on Davies.
Yeah.
And then that was it for me. There was never turning back.
Yeah, because that was
great chance that was absolutely it.
That would take you from a really, because when you look also with many of the artists that you work through in your lifetime, you mentioned Ortiz, but we should also mention Jean Toche. And
Lebel and
of course.
Ivor and all of them.
So everything was unraveled within that picture and within
and it just, to me, what they did was the truth. And I think what Metzger did was the truth.
Very much so. Now, I have another question, which maybe relates to the very beginning of your talk, the autodestructive art monument. Because also that could have referred to the actual autodestructive art monument that Gustav was building or wanting to build, and the several ones that he had made, but you didn't touch upon those in your talk. Why is that?
I was more interested in getting inside of Metzger. You know, I've spent 40 years writing about the objects and the events, and I got to know him very well, and in positive and negative ways. And I wanted to deal more deeply with his thinking about where destruction could possibly go. Yeah. And then I went back to that essay. I'd read it when the book came out, but I hadn't remembered it really. And when I started reading it very, very closely, I realized that he knew, I think he knew the time is up. There's too much destruction now. And I mean, if we just think about the events of the last week or last 2 days, it's so overwhelming that I don't know how we can continue to make destruction. We must stop it.
No, very true. And what was beautiful in your talk too is how you go to the initial discussion you had with Gustav, with all these traumatic moment that he recounts to you, which he has not recounted to such detail or depth.
Probably because it was so early.
It was that's what I was going to say. It was 16 years since the Davies. It was very close, still very sharp at that time.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I first talked with John Sharkey about Davies. And John Sharkey's memory was absolutely pristine, as was Ivor's. But I didn't talk to Ivor till later.
Right.
And when I went to interview Gustav, he did not remember well at all. And as a matter of fact, the memory that I then had given me by John Sharkey,
right,
I then told Gustav, and then we started rebuilding, and then he became interested again in thinking about Davies like that. That was an extremely interesting aspect of it. That really, the more detailed memories came from Ivor and John Sharkey. John Sharkey was an Irish poet, a magnificent human being.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I unfortunately never met him, but we spoke on the telephone.
Oh, wonderful man.
A great source, that's for sure. You mentioned that time when you met Gustav in the early 1980s, and I was interested because one of the things which unfortunately we couldn't find as I was building up on the work that led to the book, which was one research that he was carrying on at the time, which was German book design 1927-1959. Did you talk about that? Did you mention that at all?
No, because I was a graduate student. You know, he saw me in those days, probably always, as a little girl, and you know, she wasn't that sophisticated. And I remember when I finished my dissertation, he read. He said, "Oh, it's so much better than I thought it would be." which of course was devastating, but
Sure.
he didn't talk to me about those things,
Right.
Dan. He just talked to me about Davies.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, no, that's quite interesting because of course that manuscript was completed and lost, and then there's the other one about about Vermeer that he was working on, but then in the second part of the 80s, and still you did not discuss that neither.
No.
I mean, what you've discussed though is extremely important, but nonetheless, I'm just trying to distract
No.
others and more.
Actually, it was Wolf Vostell who taught me that when you are working on something, you find a few close people and you work very deep in it and you don't get distracted.
Very true. And very good. And we have many close people. Should we open to the floor, please, and with questions? And
Yes.
how do we do that? Yeah, I'm going to bring the mic.
Here you go.
Thank you, Niels.
Bless you.
Thank you so much. It was really touching and incredible lecture. I'm feeling very like, I don't know, it's super.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
It was very difficult to write.
I can imagine, but thank you. I'm just wondering about, because for me, when I went to Documenta curated by Caroline Christophe Bakardjiev, it was one of the biggest displays of Gustav Metzger at the main pavilion.
Can you hold the mic a little farther away? Away.
My question is, I mean, like before to start on the question, to try to formulate the question, of course, the biggest display of works of Gustav Metzger that I have ever seen, it was during the Documenta curated by Caroline Christophe Bakardjiev, which really surprised me because I knew him mostly from his conceptual work. And it was many drawings that they were somehow connected to the auto-destructive arts, but somehow slipping out of what we, like me as an audience, I had in my mind regarding his work. And then I also did a very elementary research, like very loose, but I found out that like after 1961, he was really like kind of went into mode of self-criticizing him about the concept of auto-destructive art and introducing the auto-creative act as a part of the auto-destructive. It means like he wrote, I mean, like, unfortunately, I cannot quote because I'm not just talking by memory. I'm not an expert on Gustav Metzger. But because of this display during the Documenta, I was kind of very triggered to find out more. And then I found some text on web, basically, that he wrote how the creativity is part of the destruction and tried to become, I mean, like not positive because definitely auto-destructive art is not negative, but try to introduce the auto-creativity as a part of the, auto-destructive process. Can you give us a little bit more light about this kind of change, and also about the drawings, because obviously he produced a big body of other work that is not so visible, I mean, in a way.
Well, as I just really briefly tried to explain, in my view, the auto-creative part of the work. Well, actually, I didn't get into this at all, so let me start over. The auto-creative art was, in fact, part of the making of auto-destructive art. And I actually didn't come to realize that until very recently, in fact, when I was working on this paper. And the way I came to realize it is he did a demonstration in 2009. You're going to have to help me with this, Andrew, for the Serpentine Gallery, 2009.
That was the show,
Yeah, so he did he did this in 2017. He did some kind of a demonstration. There's a video on YouTube. And he was demonstrating and talking about his method. And he had what are those staples, the lines of staples that he first used as a model for auto-destructive art. He found these staples on the street, and he's telling all this in the video. He found the staples in the street, not because he didn't have any money, but because he liked finding things in the street. And he found boxes and boxes, and then he holds up one of, the line of staples, how they stand together. And he says, this is more beautiful than a Mies van der Rohe building. And then he showed a group of metal parts that had been, they were long metal rods, and they were in different shapes, and they were in a pile on the desk that he was talking from. And then he held up those and he said, it's, all I have to do is drop these on the floor and they will assume their own forms. And what I realized from watching that video just recently was that this is actually the process. The auto-creative process is always already part of the auto-destructive process. Because in order to realize the auto-destructive object, he has to auto-create it. It has to be created. And then it has these elements in it which have their own lives. And he had this kind of, maybe we could call it magical thinking about, staples being as beautiful as the Mies van der Rohe. So that's the only way I can answer this, that they weren't divorced from each other, but he never really did pursue in any significant way, to my view, the auto-creative part, except in the end with the photographs. They're extraordinary, and that's, he's creating art there. They're not creating themselves, but in masking the photographs, and really I'm just coming up with this as a response to your very good question, in masking those photographs and making us crawl, somehow they become auto-creative in some way, because they have an action in relationship to the viewer. So that's the way I would answer that. But it's not a part, maybe this is a part that it would, because of your question, and because I haven't been able to answer it, and I wanted to include a discussion of that video that I just described, but my talk got too long and I cut it. Maybe that's a way I can go back to him.
And we will discuss tomorrow as well with Andrew, among others, the very early period between 1950 and 1960, when the drawing that was shown, a documented date from, and was shown. So come back then, and I'm sure we will come back further to these ideas. And actually, that's interesting. Did Gustav mention to you in your early discussions with him about the work he was doing with David Bomberg and that period of not?
He discussed all that. Yes, he discussed that, but that's all. Everything he told me has been written about.
Yeah, but what did he tell you?
I'll have to think. What did he tell me? He was very impressed with David Bomberg. I think he learned a lot from David Bomberg, and then he took a different direction. As a good student does. That's about all I can say.
Søren, please.
Yes, maybe some ideas of the documentary representation. I think when I remember, they were kind of weird in a way. But come to the question: what is the thing of auto-destructive art? I think all these drawings, or most of them, were before his theory of auto-destructive art was done. So he was in that time of Bomberg, he was studying art, and he loved art. So I think, from my opinion, I would give another direction of thinking, because when he made the art strike, it was not about abolish art or don't like art, as he also in that video maybe, or in that compilation of videos, he said he loved art and he wants to make some circumstances for art which are much more better than we have now. That's why he made this art strike. And so I think as he was drawing also in a very radical way, even when he was old, so he loved art, and it was displayed maybe as art he loved. But there was a mixture which I think was problematic, because in the brain of the documenter there was a watercolor situated, and there was written, it was like how can I say, a kind of autodestructive art, but it was not. I mean, Gustav was very, I think, very careful about his artworks he did. So there was a kind of I think, strange wording in that thing.
What you're reminding me of is an exhibition of auto-destruction art that he did at the Architectural Association. I think it was very early on, 61 or 62 or something. And he threw glass. Do you remember? 65 was it? And he dropped glass out of the windows, and it was really a problem. It was really a problem because it was very destructive and dangerous. And maybe he was afraid of actually doing anything with auto-destructive art except in the mind or these drawings, because it actually could be very dangerous. Yeah.
I have thank you also thank you very much. I'm still thinking about a lot of things, but would you elaborate a little bit more on the juxtaposition that you did between Joseph Beuys and Metzger? Is this an antagonism? Are they two heroes? And how do they relate in different ways to trauma and truth?
Yeah. I've done a lot of work. You could tell from the quotes of when I did interviews on Beuys. I think they did it from the point of view of the victim and the perpetrator, as I said. And I think that Beuys suffered greatly from whatever he did in the war. I don't think he ever really recovered from it. And you know, the late performance where he's baptized with water, it's just always there. And I don't think he recovered from fascism either. I think he was torn. I think that he made magnificent art. I think that he was an extraordinary thinker and an artist of great accomplishment. But I think that the Hitler youth was always there, always in him. And with Metzger, I've said, he was always the victim. That's why his drawings are little and he can't finish, make things. And he writes all the time. And Beuys wrote all the time too. And Beuys talked all the time too. This is a way of thinking of, a process of thinking out one's past and destiny, which they could never, both of them could never come to, in my view. And I had never paired them before until I started to write this talk. And then it just came to me, I can't just talk about this victim. I have to put him next to the perpetrator, who I could talk to you for hours about what Beuys did.
Well, we're gonna have to take a break now.
Yeah, no, but I won't. But then I had to put them together because they actually fit. And it's another direction I think I might pursue with all the work that I've already done on Beuys.
But maybe something interesting in the relationship between Beuys and Metzger, because I mean, in this talk of information action in 1972,
yeah, of
it's
course.
very interesting, and I didn't get the paper I already written, because there is a dispute on the one hand, And on the other hand, because in the typoscript of the archive of the tape written, there is the translator, and the translator was Gustav. So if you hear it, the document, so Gustav helped Beuys to manage the situation, because his English was so bad that some of the audience couldn't understand him. So, and this is maybe also what Norman Rosenthal told me once, that Beuys was very keen on that Gustav is part of the Art into Society. So the participation of Gustav in Art into Society was really driven, among others, but recently very, very strong from Beuys. So they had a strange relationship.
A love-hate. or victim-perpetrator, really. And that is a love-hate. You know, I spoke about that the victim also thinks of himself or herself as a perpetrator. Yeah.
And the, yeah.
Actually, lives though, you have both that are under this kind of state of trauma from being either the perpetrator or the victim. And what I found that really fascinating. It just opened up a world. And Niels, we were on the same page there. We wanted to ask the same question. But I was wondering if you would also maybe speak more about the paradoxes that creates. Like
I missed the first part of that.
Oh, in this sort of relationship between Beuys and Metzger, this victim perpetrator, and how it flips, and these kind of paradoxes between, you know, sliding in and out of this kind of state of being a victim and being
I would never call Gustav a perpetrator.
Well, the invention of like, you know, and how it's, you know, you're basically, yeah, invention, like the invention of story. You gave more examples with Beuys, with his past, you know, in relationships to their own history and their experience of being a victim or a perpetrator. Does that make sense?
Well, I actually had many more pages on Metzger and what happened to him as a result of the Holocaust. What's interesting, though, is that it's not very safe to talk about Beuys the way I did today.
Yeah.
And so it feels that I spoke more about Beuys. But page-wise, I spoke much more about Metzger.
Sure.
And we're going to talk on them. I'll give it to you. And we're going to talk on Saturday with Norman Rosenthal a lot about the arts in society, society into art, and that very moment of 1974, 1972. So come then too. Ivor, we're going to talk for an hour. Are you sure?
Sorry. I just want to say, first of all, that I was astonished and in wonder and joy at what I heard for the last year, over the last hour. And I thought it was very interesting the way that you compared these two figures, and also the questions that you three of you asked about this relationship between Beuys and Gustav. And I did happen to be at that. I think Gustav and I went together to the Tate that day and heard this. And different themes of it and different ideas of it have occurred to me when I've recollected it. But one of the ideas and one of the differences of attitude that occurs to me is that Gustav was criticizing Beuys's idea of egalitarianism, that everyone should have the same benefits that we have.
Absolutely.
And Gustav was saying to him, I mean, I'm not trying to remember what he said, but the gist was, so you want everyone that you introduce these ideas to in Africa and so on to go through the same agony that we've gone through in the end. And Gustav, the two different attitudes to me, crudely summing up, crudely generalizing, was that Beuys could be accused of having good intentions and imposing civilization upon people, but that Gustav did not want, he used to talk a lot about Africa, as it must have been a long time ago. He didn't want people to go the same way as European civilization. He wanted them to find their own way. And if there is a kind of a victimization about civilization, whenever we hear the word, lots of words that come out, we know that they have rather brutal accompaniments. Democracy, for example, the Arab Spring, and so on. And we don't know the source of these, and I don't want to go and talk about that. I simply want to stop there.
Thank you, Ivor. And this is a great introduction to what we're going to have together. I propose that we take a 5-minute break, a short one, much shorter than what. But in the meantime, though, thank you so much, Kristine, for this wonderful enlightening lecture. And to be continued in 5 minutes then. Thank you. Hello, welcome back. And we're going to continue that exciting first evening with welcoming another giant. What a great honor. So please let me introduce you to our next speaker. Oh, yeah, speaker is good actually. Ivor Davies.
Like those shows where the
Yes,
man
indeed.
runs up the stairs. Yeah.
And as you walk slowly, I will tell who you are. Born in 1935, Ivor Davies is a Welsh artist, art historian, curator, writer, activist, and polyglot. Varying from fluency to working knowledge in Welsh, English, French, Spanish, Italian, German, Russian, Latin, and general knowledge of and interest in other languages, including early Celtic languages, Arabic, Armenian, and Chinese. And as I was compiling rather, Ivor's biography, it became obvious that this is a necessary addition. As even just this afternoon, we was talking about what we were going to talk. You kept on switching from languages and to languages, which was so impressive. And I'd rather warn everyone that if this happens, this is why. He's one of the foremost figures in contemporary Welsh art, even though I would take off the Welsh and just say art. He is a recipient of numerous awards and has been the focus of many exhibitions, including the major retrospective Silent Explosion at the National Museum, Cardiff. Davies co-organized the Destruction in Art Symposium Dias in 1966 together with Gustav Metzger and John Sharkey, as we've mentioned. He was among the first, discussed, studied in depth rather. He was the first to use explosive in elaborate performances in the UK, not to say Europe, but nonetheless, this is again something that we have to touch upon. Davies holds a PhD from the University of Edinburgh entitled Certain Aspects of Art and Theory in Russia from 1905 to 1924 in their relationship to avant-garde art and ideas in the West. Just that could be a discussion, but we're going to have crammed. So as the first director of the Turbot Rice Art Center in Edinburgh University, Ivor has organized over 60 exhibitions from its opening in 1970 through to 1978, including exhibitions on the Vienna Secession, Chinese scrolls, watercolors and drawings by George Gross, Eduardo Paolozzi, Roman Baroque drawings, or again, in November-December 1972, on kinetic art. So again, which subject to pick on will be hard. Since 1977, Davies is a member of the Becca Group of Social and Political Artists of Wales. Publications include The Essential Silent Explosion, Occasional Paper 2015 with essential contribution by Kristine Stiles, Andrew Wilson, and Heike Rome, and another forthcoming book entitled Encounters with Ivor Davies. Please join me in welcoming Ivor. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming here today for this celebration and for the need for art to change the world. And as I've said, we're going to focus mainly on Dias and these years, these iconic, these heroic years. But what I was really keen on as well was to draw from your past and really focus upon your early beginnings as well. When you became an artist, how you became, what it meant for you, and how there was that somehow logical, at least, path that one can follow that really leads to that major epiphany of that was to become the Destruction in Art Symposium in 1966. But before then, I would be extremely interested for you to really draw the picture of how you came interested in the idea of arts first and foremost.
I have always been interested in every aspect of art, really, all my life. And I've kept all the drawings from the age of 1 throughout, purely out of a kind of interest and egocentric attitude, perhaps, but to see the development, like the development of handwriting. And it's quite fascinating. I did a lot of drawings during the Second World War of subjects of war, and and I remember the Second World War very clearly, unfortunately. And I remember Kristine Stiles, writing at a fairly early time that most, if not all, the artists involved in the Destruction in Art Symposium had some experience of that Second World War. It's difficult to know how such a thing may affect one, but I remember as a child being put under the stairs and my mother saying, "Hold this candle. If we don't come back, strike the match, light it, and tell them who you are." And other times when I prayed to God to not be killed, then I thought, pray to God, if I could live forever, perhaps, additionally. And then I remember praying, in addition to that, if it could just be possible for me to become a great Messiah, rather like Jesus, but with a sign of the circle. So in a way, that's haunted me a bit all my life, but it hasn't really happened in that way.
Well, yet.
But what has happened is that I have always been passionate about art, and every aspect of it, its chemistry, the history of art, the art of any sort, bad art especially. And I wanted to always go to the extremes with art. And I really admired extremists like people who went to the extremes, like Tinguely, Jean Tinguely, for example, in the 50s. I thought he was interesting as a kinetic artist. And then to, in a way, break through with the homage to New York and these explosives in the desert, to something which was almost a fifth dimension. And this would be, to me, in my mind, something very extreme. This was before I met Gustav. I met Gustav in 1965. I think it was the late part of 1965. And we were introduced through a former student of mine called Peter Holiday, a person that I would say was a genius. Apart from being extremely knowledgeable, I won't go into the history of his life, but he was a great writer as well, and a great researcher who didn't care about publishing much. And he took me to a demonstration that Gustav was making in London, and he introduced us. And from then on, I think we felt something. I think so. I certainly did, in common. And we used to meet frequently we used to meet as frequently as possible in restaurants, vegan restaurants. He was a vegan even before it became hardly heard of, and a vegetarian. And Peter Holiday then, in May, in the beginnings of he used to invite me to give lectures at Ravensbourne College of Art, where he was a lecturer. And these were wonderful occasions, and we should talk, have a wonderful time to talk together. And he then said to me, "I'd like to organize a Destruction in Art event." And I think the name Symposium was my idea, suggested to him it should be called a symposium, because I like the idea of those illustrations of Greeks drinking wine, chaiselongs and so on. And so this took place in May, and he invited an artist, a concrete poet called Dom Sylvestre Huedad. He invited Mark Boyle and one or two other people, including me, and of course Gustav. And I remember saying to him, I like the idea of the name of the thing, or at least the poster which advertises it. I took the liberty of making a poster, and pinned it on the wall, which was, I think, if I can remember it, movement, destruction, creation, destruction, creation, movement, creation, destruction, movement, the whole kind of apparently not a very good kinetic poem. Anyway, and this was a wonderful occasion, and it was mostly for the students of the college where Peter was working.
Can you tell us a bit more about what kind of personality was Peter?
Yeah.
I would.
Yes. Well, the thing that would first strike one was he was quite incredibly good looking. He was, sorry, he was quite amazingly good looking. I'd walk down the street with him and women would actually turn around to look at him. And he tried to persuade them they were looking at me, but they certainly weren't. They were definitely looking at him. He had brilliant blue eyes and jet black hair. And he was a good swimmer. We used to go swimming a lot. And very good physique, but a great intellect, and was interested in practically everything. He wrote a brilliant thesis, for example, for Imperial College, one which was honored, with a special honor, which hadn't been honored for 20 years, on I read it very carefully, he used to show me everything he'd written. And it was about the arrival of porcelain and paper into Central Asia and then Europe. I won't go into detail, but it seemed they did arrive simultaneously, and it was a most interesting subject, believe me, when he wrote it. And he didn't care about publishing. He did this as a thesis simply for Imperial College. It's never been published. He then became interested in printing but photography, and was a very good photographer. Unfortunately, the photographs all disappeared. He liked to take his students, as did I, to real places, to real Winslow Newton factories, for example, and Cheddar Cake, Cheddar Gorge, and all sorts of places like it, to see the reality of art history. Well, his knowledge was wide, and that's, oh yes, his knowledge was wide, extremely wide.
Right. So the title was the Symposium on Destruction and Creation,
Yeah.
and that was on the 23rd of May.
Yeah.
What led you to the interest in destruction yourself? Because that's very early on in your development as well.
Yes, admittedly, it was partly Jean Tinguely. But when I met Gustav, I became obviously enthralled by the whole idea, and I recollected that aspects of my life were strangely connected with destruction. Not just the war, the Second World War, where of course we were bombed and everything, but almost drew my attention to the aspects of the inevitability of destruction. All the most carefully painted oil paintings will destroy themselves eventually if they're not interfered with. Anyway, and I had been also planning to try and extend from during the 50s and 60s, trying to extend art beyond the canvas. In 1954, I got two photographs of a peculiar thing, which was a performance or a happening. Someone said to me, that isn't a happening because they hadn't invented the name yet. I like that idea anyway, but this was a serious comment. And I suppose you could argue that it was a proto-Harmony. Then, by the later 50s and early 60s, I was also interested in a more organized, carefully organized, quasi-theatrical extension of painting into space and destruction, and mostly the breaking through paper and objects on a kind of proscenium, which would be both visual art and some kind of physical breakthrough as visual art. I suppose I have always been quite interested in I've been always interested in the political and the social ideas, and also in the connections that they have with art. In fact, I believed at one time that all art is political. I still believe it, actually, but and therefore there was some way of getting nearer to the reality of people organizing themselves than an art which was regarded as superior in some way.
I would be really interested for you to develop furthermore about your relation with well, that interest rather with kinetic art, because this was something which was extremely important for Gustav at the turn of the 1960s.
Yeah.
When he staged his first cardboard exhibition for
Yeah.
him, it was really about the movement one could make with these cardboards. It was
Yeah.
something which was not
Yeah.
static, but that could evolve in time. And if I understand you, through Frank Popper, you were introduced to many of these
Yes.
great kinetic artists
Yes.
of the Paris scene. Can you tell me how you met Frank and how that led to this experiment with Grav? And speak in the mic.
Yes, I'll speak. Yes, there was an exhibition in Edinburgh. I think it was in the early 60s, about 1963, where I went to Edinburgh to teach art history at the university. The modern period was my specialty, and I had been familiar with kinetic art up until then, but when that exhibition came, I think I met Frank Popper through that exhibition somehow. And I went to Paris then and met practically all the kinetic artists on the Groupe de l'Art Visuel, Groupe de Recherche de l'Art Visuel, and learned a lot from them. And I had been doing shapes which were not actually shapes that moved, but which were curves on flat or irregular shaped curved surfaces, which as you walked past, they changed their shapes. It's a curve known, I think, as a hyperbolic curve. And I've learned that this hyperbolic curve is something quite profound in reality. It's, for example, the curve that a rocket makes when it takes off and then leaves this atmosphere, our atmosphere, and curves away. That's a hyperbolic curve. It's another example of the hyperbolic curve is if you have a stick that tells the time every hour, and you follow the shadow of that stick around, that creates a hyperbolic curve. Sundial, it's really a kind of sundial. And there are other examples of this which occur in nature. But I was very excited. I exhibited one or two, I think, in a gallery that was in London at that time called Signals. And they were exhibited also last year in New York because they tried to revive the contents of some of the exhibitions. So it was quite exciting to do that. And this intrigued me for long, but while it didn't appear to have much connection with destruction or with explosions, to me, it wasn't disconnected because there was this kind of, which was explosion.
Right, which was interesting because one of the first things that you read, that was read for the first day of Davies, the symposium on the 9th of September, was the Homage to New York by Tanguy, which was a catalog that, as far as I understand, Gustav had kept preciously, and you read that manifesto. So it's really interesting to me to find the moment that, yes, destruction is kinetic by essence, but that kinetic was also find its way to articulate that beginning of a new phase in art and in your own development. Now, as we were preparing our discussions, and we were really interested to find out the beginning. So how did Davies evolve, and whether we had an accurate picture of Davies today?
Yes, that's a good question. Yeah.
I thought you would like it.
Well, what happened was that immediately after the symposium, which was a comparatively small symposium that Peter Holiday organized, Gustav wrote to me and said that he was planning to do a symposium, which would happen in September that same year, and would I help him? And of course, I was delighted. I lived part of the time in Edinburgh, but I used to spend a lot of time in London. And so it wasn't difficult for me to talk to him frequently and discuss ideas. And though the person, in the development of that symposium, the person who indicated the possible participants was not me at all, but it was through Mario Amaya, an art historian who's published a number of things, sadly died about 30 years ago. And Mario knew Al Hansen in America, and Al Hansen had published the first book. I got a copy of it. I meant to bring it. I forgot. Everything You Need to Know About Happenings or something, you know. And this practically gave you the names of all the people in the United States who were doing happenings quite openly and casually. And so I don't think their addresses were there, but you could trace the addresses from where they were doing the performances. And so Gustav, as I believe, wrote to a number of them, especially Fluxus artists, but a great many of the Fluxus artists couldn't attend this conference, and they could send papers, so their papers were read. Yes.
Yeah, and one of them was George Martinez, who sent the text that US surpasses all Nazi genocide records, which was being read by Beverly Rowe.
Yeah.
For instance, in the same session that you were chairing then.
That's right.
And as you mentioned, indeed, Mario Amaya was extremely influential in the people to invite. As I understand, when he came back from New York, he said to Gustav, and you most probably, that you have to invite Yoko Ono, that he had just met during his journey then.
Indeed. And that was very interesting.
And then you would, I mean, we're jumping forward and backward, but then you would, of course, take part in the performance by Yoko on the very last day of the shadow piece.
It wasn't. Yes, I did. Yes. And
we have great pictures of you on the floor.
Yes, she wanted us to work together, but anyway, but indeed, that was a very good piece. And we also, in the last day of the performance, I did a piece. I don't know if she did. On the stage, which wasn't recorded, but it was the best performance I've ever done. It wasn't filmed. I've got films of most of my performances, of all my performances, or most of them except that one. But it was with two extraordinary women. One of them was a colored South African whose parents met in Mecca on pilgrimage, and the other was a pianist who had a long silver dress on and played, I keep putting it down, sorry, played a bright red piano, and she'd composed music herself. And I still don't know whether the music she composes, the songs that she composed were, how can I put it, truly meant sincere compositions, or whether they were kind of parodies in which the ending rhymes like dove and love and time and rhyme and things. And it didn't seem important because there was such a contrast between what she was playing in these very sentimental songs and the destruction which Jamila King was doing with bottles of blood, bottles and South African labels on them, and so on. Without going into the whole history of that performance, I did write it up in a catalogue of an exhibition I had 2 years ago.
Silent explosion. Yes, you. Yeah, you do carry a proper account of the silent explosion.
Yeah, I did. The publishers were Occasional Papers, who are now in Brussels. Yes, it was. I think it was a very important event, really. The Destruction Art Symposium in September. And Gustav describes the one that was in May, organized by Peter Holiday as a sort of stepping stone. But the one in September was extraordinary because something I realized much later, a lot of those people had never met each other. Maybe most of them had never met each other before. And I like to do performances with people who've never met each other because there's no kind of rapport between them. There's no kind of sympathy or mind reading. They're total strangers. I did one 2 years ago on a beach, and there was an organ which I'd built, which was an explosive organ in 1966, which I was going to use, but I think the chemicals were something wrong with them. It began to go on fire, so I rushed out into the street and got a fireman, and it was taken away and destroyed in Woolwich Arsenal. Anyway, so I wrote an account of this and said that I would redo something to do with this in 2016, which was exactly 50 years later, I believe. And so I organized this thing on a seashore with a lot of graffiti around it, and 12 people who'd never met before. And it was amazing what happened, because I suppose they were so careful with strangers. They did everything very carefully. And it included music on an Aeolian harp, and a trumpet, and I made a film of it, and then got some of the performers to perform in front of it. My daughter played my granddaughter, I think, played the trumpet. I'm a great-grandfather now. But, and filmed the shot of that performance. And then, of course, there's the pain of editing things, but I'm going a bit off the point.
Yeah.
Sorry.
But no, however, it would be interesting to come back to the idea of people that never met each other beforehand, because that was all premises of Davies. And you did show that map that we gave away earlier on. And I think that was extremely interesting, because when you were describing that idea to me of bringing people that had never been together, was the difference between that and a rock group, for instance, a rock band, where they know which note are going to be played by whom at what time, but where it was the unexpected and nonetheless the same language.
Yes.
And I'd be interested in if you can, as you were drawing up that map, that mental cosmology of whomever was taking place in there, what that brings back to, what kind of memory it brings back now, though?
what it brings back now is the sadness that a lot of people weren't in it. There were no women in it. There were women there. Yoko Ono was there. Barbara, she was there. And the two magnificent women took part in that performance I tried to describe. They weren't there. Neither was Rafael Ortiz. He wasn't in there either. And but the people there was a kind of strange, perhaps because we didn't know each other, or perhaps even if we'd known each other, there's a slightly suspicious atmosphere in the air. And I remember Ralph, and I think Gustav didn't help it much. But I remember Ralph Ortiz. I thought, who is this bloke doing things? And he felt the same thing about me. And there was a suspicious, we kind of didn't like each other. Then he turned up years later at an art college where I was teaching. I didn't invite him, it was somebody else there. We fell in love. We really liked each other, you know, and I got him to stay at my place, and we sat up late at night, practically half a night talking. And so it's something to do with not meeting people before, if you like. But I think it's an amazing photograph. Nothing to do with or anything other than the photographer was a genius. Tom Picton was a very famous photographer interested in social life in 1950s, and he took some quite superb photographs. Remember, he said he took a number of photographs, of course, so this is just one of them, which was printed in Life magazine at the time. And I've got the others where people are kind of more relaxed and ha-ha and laughing and things. But he said, look serious. So we all look serious. It looks like a kind of pretty dangerous situation. Yeah, and I can remember interesting things going on. Pity Jean-Jacques isn't here. He was terribly tired. And there's a picture of Jean-Jacques Lebel, who has just left the room to have a rest because he was falling asleep.
Hopefully we'll be back tomorrow. So
He'll be back
maybe
tomorrow. I said you can sleep through my lecture anyway. Probably will. And but he didn't want to. And Werner Schreib was, nobody liked him somehow. I quite liked him. And he was slightly awkward, and he had wonderful names for different art forms. The things he did were, they looked as though they were like street signs and things, you know? And a picture of Adenauer with a face on fire and things like that. Pro Diaz, that was, I think he's from Brazil. That wasn't his proper name. And he would put powder, powder onto canvases and then set them alight. And so you get this I got photographs of all this. I got this huge collection of absolute rubbish from the period, you know. I couldn't throw away a ticket. Isn't there a film with some, anyway. I'm a bit like that. I can't throw things away.
well, which is good for us now.
Yes, I have the best. I've got the best.
Well, archive on that at the very least.
Yeah.
And also collection on Ivor Davies's work, I understand.
Yes, I collect my own work from pre-birth almost. And but these people were interesting. I mean, Freddie Bonanno, they call him, I don't know why, but he was actually a scientist. And I don't know why he came, and I haven't been able to find out anything about him. Then, of course, Al Hansen is there, with a fireman's helmet on and big sort of staff. And he was the most charming person. He seemed to get on with everybody. Juan Hidalgo is still alive in the Canary Islands, I believe, and big kind of performances and mature gay scene stuff, I believe. I haven't seen him since. Sorry? Zach, yes, Zach was his big thing. He gave me a beautiful book which had just letters in it. Beautiful.
Robin Page?
Robin Page, yeah. Robin, I was very friendly with Robin in those days. And one of his things was just digging a hole. But he did it with such conviction and such intention that it really had meaning.
And created a flood, right?
Yes, he did create a flood.
Yeah, in Better Books.
Yeah, I didn't want to talk about that, but yeah. Yeah. And yes, Better Books was it was a big center for people to go. And John Lathan was very interesting. He used books in his work, some mostly ones who had been singed or burnt, both in canvases and in constructions, such as one near the British Museum, which he set up, and had to move at the last minute because of some law or other. And the thing that intrigued me about him, I mean, is that he gave talks, and he gave one at the Destruction and Art Symposium, but his talks, most people said they were incomprehensible. They couldn't understand them. And I tried hard. I thought I could understand them. And he gave one at the symposium at a time when I was chairing quite a lot of the performances at the symposium, which was not actions now, but reading papers and discussing ideas. And I took notes on that particular occasion of him, what he said. And of course, you can never know without actually asking them whether you've got it right if they're dead. Not usually, anyway. And then, yes, who else? Henri Chopin was quite a hero, actually, during the Second World War and in the underground. And I remember him doing peculiar voices and peculiar sounds with the mouth, which were intriguing, sort of real, I can't impersonate them, but they would be really unusual non-speech sounds. Things like this kind of thing. And I'm just trying to give you an idea of the extraordinary non-tonal, atonal kind of vocabulary that he possessed in giving out these types of music. Then I don't know.
Well,
Tsipanidis, sorry.
No, I was just going to say one also. You wanted us to address a little bit on the idea of, because of course he's on the picture, of what was it like to work with Gustav on that?
Oh, it was great. It was wonderful. Gustav could be hellishly difficult, but I don't think I think he was only difficult with me once when he said to me, "You look like an art historian." He thought it was a sort of insult. Because I used to say to him, I don't really want to look like an art historian. So that was the biggest insult. But I don't know, we just talked about ideas all the time and exchanged ideas, and it was tremendous pleasure. I mean, I went to see him, you know, in his last years. I wish I could have seen him more, and and the last time in his life, his mind was totally clear. We had conversations, and I tried to emphasize on him what positive results he had achieved over the years, rather than putting new ideas out to try and make him reminisce with regard to relating art to society, or relating politics to art, society to art, a social image in his own art, and of course his ideas. I said to him once, I mean, a long time ago now, not in the last years, I said, "You don't do much art, do you, Gustav?" He said, "No, why should I make those dealers rich?" But I remember a dealer coming to us. It was Lefebvre, was it? Lefebvre? In London, saying, "Would you like to come round for coffee to my house in West London?" And we went there. He was a very well-known dealer. So yeah, and there were no pictures on his wall at all, and the walls were all painted battleship grey. And he said to Gustav and me, you do destruction in art. Do you think you'd ever come back and do, I was going to say, objective art, objects and things?" We both sort of said, "Yeah, probably, yes, I think we might." He wouldn't have anything to do with us after that. That's perfectly true.
One of the other thing I was interested in asking you about your relationship with Gustav is especially right after the symposium, when you thought of taking the symposium Dias internationally. You talked at length about New York, but you also had different ideas. And in your archive, you have all the correspondence with, especially the making in the New York one. Do you remember a bit what happened there? Why did it fall? Why did it not happen to the extent what you wanted?
Well, I think Gustav had the idea of this just being the first symposium and having others in different cities. But I don't know, I think I just didn't want to go to New York.
Right. Yeah, because to be clear, it happened in New York, organized by Jean Tache and John Hendricks.
It was at after that horrible event, the shooting of King.
Yeah.
And
which was the reason why they stopped the symposium, if I remember correctly.
Yeah. But you know, maybe I should have gone. Maybe it shouldn't have done that. I don't know. But and Gustav didn't want to go either. I think maybe he thought there wouldn't be that many people going.
Right.
So
also, if I remember well, at the end of the symposium and before the idea of the expansion came the major issue of the trial.
Oh yes, yes, that was almost surrealist.
Mm-hmm.
I wish I was in Edinburgh at the time. I wish I'd been in London and become part of that now.
Right.
But no, it was Gustav and John Sharkey.
Indeed, trial for obscenity, right?
Yes, yes.
Because one of the things which was interesting also is that in one of the few letters that Gustav has sent you, which are in your archive, he does complain about having to raise that amount of money now.
Yes,
and which becomes a hindrance for the future of what could be become with Dias.
Yes. But the performers didn't give any money. And I think what the complaints were about were what we would regard as absurd. Now there wasn't any. I mean, the idea of indecency, I was told, was invented after the Napoleonic Wars, of the victims of the war revealing their wounds when they were begging in the streets. But there was the atmosphere of that about these carcasses that Nietzsche had fixed to the walls and was using as performance materials. There was that kind of aspect of indecency, it seemed to me.
Right.
Otherwise, these days, I wouldn't even notice it, I don't think.
Yeah, change of culture and change of society. I mean, there is so much we should talk about, but one of the questions that we were really interested in discussing as well tonight was Gustav's attitude to science.
Oh, yes.
And I'd be very keen to bring that back because you selected a few texts that you thought highlighted really the shared belief that you and Gustav had about science.
Yes.
And maybe we should bring this as well into that.
Gustav, to me, I never thought much about it at the time, but looking back, he had a very unusual, he had a very interesting attitude to science. It was a kind of love-hate attitude. And he wanted scientists to come to Davies, to the Destruction and Art Symposium in September, but all too few for his taste came, though there were one or two quite extraordinary ones, unusual ones. One, for example, who regarded disease as an art. And anyway, but what strikes me is that we are all really part of our time. We are only the extension of the arms of our time. Nothing we say is original, really. We get it all from other people. We do what we're told. And people who tell us not to do what we're told, okay, we obey them. But certain phases, there have been phases of extreme religion and extreme atheism. And it's all a kind of fashion that rises and falls or changes its nature because we are the extension of that world. And it struck me that Gustav was, in his negative attitude to science, probably influenced by other people who'd written or done things. And I think to be influenced by other people, you need not have ever read their works, but other people digest it and accumulate it, and it comes out in a possibly different form from their lips than from the person who intended it. For example, this makes me think that Gustav was very much of his time. Stephen Dutch, natural and applied scientists, University of Wisconsin, Green Bay, anti-science of the 1960s and 70s, exposed by writers such as Charles Reich, Louis Mumford, Jacques Ellul, Theodore Roszak. And Theodore Roszak made a list of about 9 things. Science and technology are out of control. 2, science and technology force workers into degrading and monotonous jobs. 3, technology forces people to consume unnecessary goods and services. 4, science and technology place decision-making in the hands of a technocratic elite. Science and technology cut man off from the natural world. Science and technology make man superficial. Technology creates worse problems than it solves. Science and technology restrict freedom. The scientific world view robs world of mystery and beauty. Then, okay, I won't read them all, just kind of scraps for you to get a picture, which I think is quite a phenomenon. In 1964, Jacques Berzin, Science, the Glorious Entertainment. Science, a faith as fantastical as any history. And he warned against the use of scientific thought to suppress considerations of meaning as integral to human existence. While many scientists and skeptics point out cognitive biases that may permeate commensurate thinking and abuse, illogical conclusions, the same biases are much less likely to be examined within the scientific community. In other words, scientists are criticizing all of us for being irrational, hippie-ish, and yet they've got the same faults themselves, because they too have fashions. For example, 1 minute your doctor tells you you've got high cholesterol, and then you go back a year later and say, no, we're not interested in cholesterol, we're interested in blood pressure. It's so. Anyway, and then Paul Feyerabend, I should say, advanced the idea of epistemological anarchism, which suggests that there are no useful and exception-free methodological rules governing the progress of science or the growth of knowledge, and that the idea that science can or should operate according to universal and universal rules is unrealistic, pernicious, and detrimental to science itself. He said, he went on to say that in democratic society, science should be equal to other ideological or social institutions, such as religion or education or magic or mythology. Dominance of science was socially authoritarian and unjustified. Yeah, and I won't read them all, but zoologist Peter Kropotkin was interesting one. The theory of evolution is overstressed as painful. We must struggle to survive. The way of life which is said to be influenced by capitalism and the struggling lifestyles of people living within it. Karl Marx also thought science was largely driven by and used as capital. But of course, the theory of evolution depends also on cooperation, as well as elbowing your neighbor down, allegedly. And I want to, well, the most extreme perhaps of the anti-scientists was Ted Kaczynski, Theodore John Kaczynski, born 1947, the Unabomber. He became known as the Unabomber. I don't know if you remember. He was a mathematician and an anarchist, abandoned his career in 1969, killed 3 people, scientists, and injured 23 others with bombs and so on. People involved with modern technology were the victims. And he was interested in nature and obsessed with the terrible destruction of nature, as we are now indeed, centered, and he said that this was the center of his form of anarchism. And I think he had some interesting colleagues at Harvard.
Indeed, yeah. He was in the same class, if I'm correct, as Tony Conrad and Henry Flint. Yeah, of course, please, by all means. No, Mike, at least you.
I want to say something about Ted Kaczynski that's important because he was a very brilliant young man at Harvard, and he was subjected to horrible stress tests by psychologists at Harvard, and he really suffered from them. And then he graduated, got his PhD in any case, and then he taught at Berkeley for a while, and then he really went out into the wilderness and became the Unabomber. But the whole group of scientists who were doing those stress tests, they were so harsh that they sent one of the scientists to Canada to continue them because it was too much at Harvard. So there's a whole background of real mental abuse at Harvard of Ted Kaczynski, which set him off. I think I really always want to say that.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Brilliant. Yes. The link with Henry Flint couldn't be more accurate at that time.
Yeah, the idea of stress on such people. I mean, I heard Gustav say that.
Mike.
Oh yeah, I heard Gustav say that scientists should be killed, but I couldn't imagine Gustav really doing anything like that. I think he said it at during one of his papers at the symposium. But I've got I think that point is clear, that Gustav was so disappointed that scientists didn't come, but those who came were remarkably interesting. I don't go in for it, but
No,
there was.
it does bring a very interesting picture, though.
Yeah, I mean, Joseph Burke was quite interesting. I thought he's still alive in London. I believe he's alive, isn't he? Joseph Burke. I believe, yeah, same age as me. I'm just about that. And it's he was, of course, he did work with R.D. Laing, who'd help begin an anti-psychiatry movement, if you call it that, against the orthodoxy of the time, and stimulated new ways of thinking about illness. And I remember him talking about certain illnesses and describing the diseases as beautiful and having limited time, but at a certain moment, you know, you'd be covered with butterfly shapes, and it was an illness or associated some various things. Fully revealed, inquired ichthyosis, Acanthus nigericans. This is the proper Greek name for that particular illness. And it defined as a serious systematic disease, including visceral cancer, which can result from it, and may be indirectly signaled by the development of cutaneous eruptions, sometimes with a rash. That's apparently what it is. And there's another one that seems to have fish scales. Well, he a most unusual man, had discovered some kind of aesthetic in Dr. Joseph Burke, discovered this aesthetic in illness. And of course, I mean, it's an awful thing to say, but I think sometimes people do love their illness in some ways. They possess it. And you can tell, I hesitate to say this, but you can tell them a very simple way of getting rid of an illness, which is Granny's remedy of drinking barley water or something. They don't want to do it. They avoid doing it somehow. And the illness persists, but you know, it's another story, really. Sorry.
Okay. Well, thank you. We're going to be running out of time soon,
Yeah.
though. But may I open? Anybody would like to join the conversation, please? Sure. Yeah. Okay, microphone's coming, Jonathan. And then Niels. Thank you.
No, you.
Laura, Jonathan first.
Thank you. That was a fascinating talk, and I think this is the most interesting photograph. I wonder whether the heads, the ladies who were looking in the street might have been looking at you, as well as Peter Holiday.
Peter Holiday isn't in it.
No, but you were also a very fine-looking young man.
Next to Gustav.
Yes, I can see. But I wondered, it doesn't look as if it would have been an environment very hospitable to women artists. I wonder whether you could comment on that.
It's always very embarrassing to show this because there aren't any women artists in it. And it wasn't meant to be like a man's club, because there were brilliant women around, as we mentioned, you know, like my friends who in the performance artist piece, and Yoko Ono and Barbara Gladstone was a very good dancer and strong participant. But I regret that they weren't in it, but just the chance of getting that many people together was amazing, I think. I wanted to say that, not to be so obsessed with anti-science, but I wanted to say that Gustav was different from, I know he must have absorbed it and was conscious, but his difference was something of the difference that I discovered when I later on started to do research into Russian art of the early 20th century. I seem to be reading about people who are remarkably like Gustav, who were unsuitable for national service in the Russian army, and who were truly spiritual in many senses of the word. Sometimes even earlier, in the heyday of communism in the mid-19th century, there were strong communists, writers such as Dobrolyubov and Pisarev, who had a certain attitude which reminded me of Gustav. Like one of their sayings was, Shakespeare or a pair of boobs. Or Pisarev, I think, said another name. But this comparative comparison reminded me very much of Gustav's sensitivity and asceticism. And the other thing I felt with Gustav, that he was the son of devout parents. And I noticed the same with many of the communist writers. And I'm not sure about the ones at the beginning of the 20th centuries who went to the extreme of their art form. I mean, the Black Square is a real extreme by Malevich, and Malevich writes of breaking through. I mean, whereas the French tradition is more one of observation with the senses for understanding, there is a Russian tradition, because the Russians never had the Renaissance. There's a Russian tradition which is breaking through into the spiritual, as they say. And this is where the knowledge comes. It's a kind of breakthrough. And I felt that Gustav had something of that quality about his thinking. He didn't belong to any of the other types of caricatured people of the time that I can imagine or remember. Perhaps I might be going too far in saying that, but I don't think I am.
I think that's really true.
Absolutely true.
Because I mean, one of my abiding memories of Gustav is the extreme emphasis he laid on aesthetics, and he would find it in the most strangest of places sometimes as well. And I think that's very much part of that idea of finding a spirit somewhere else. I think it's very much part of his background. It's very much part of the trauma that he suffered as a child and continued to suffer. And I think it's also very much part of the way he fell into art in the 1940s and in the early 50s, especially through his contact with David Bomberg, but not exclusively so. I think that's absolutely correct. But I've got a very particular question I'd like to ask you, Ivor, because you were involved with John Sharkey and with Gustav in the organization of the Destruction and Art Symposium. And one of the aspects that always kind of fascinates me about the organization, and also fascinates me about the way Gustav, pre the Destruction and Art Symposium, sort of tried to lay trails. It was almost as if he was creating documentation in advance. And this is what I'm referring to, is the sense in which he laid great emphasis on publicity on the press. You know, it's like most of the papers that come out of the Destruction Art Symposium are press releases. You know, when I think the success he had in getting the Daily Express to cover one of his manifestos, and it could be done at a time to take the lead, in a sense, on Jean Tinguely. And I just wonder, sort of thinking back to those days when you were organizing the Destruction Art Symposium, what did Gustav say about that? About the need for publicity, the need to create, looking at it retrospectively now for myself, it feels very much that if you're an artist making ephemeral work that is an event or a set of events, work that doesn't leave much trace behind, that there are no objects that can be traded to create a historical record. The only record that you're going to have are the press that you can plant, in a sense, the documentation. And certainly when I first met Gustav, that idea of documentation was the way he constructed his history. So,
no, it's perfectly true. Gustav and I used to go around Fleet Street with handouts like these that you're going, and you know, actually ring the bell and knock on the doors or whatever there was going on to get into the offices and hand them out and say you might be interested in this. And we went around a lot of those places, and yet in many ways I think he despised the superficial aspect of it. You say, oh yeah, this person would do anything for publicity, you know. But this was not quite that. It was, as you say, leaving a trail which could flower. Something would come of it, perhaps. You know, it was always a hope. Indeed, yeah. And and then again, connected with that in some strange way, is Gustav's recognition of himself. I said to him once, oh, this is relatively recently, about 15, 20 years ago. I said, why do you carry a black bag around with all your stuff in it? Why don't you leave it at the left luggage or somewhere? And he said, it's because I'm a refugee. It's the way refugees live. And it was like a reflection of someone who had recognized that this was a way. Later on, I wouldn't need to arrange to meet him. I'd bump into him in the street, in the road, wheeling with the cars and bicycles and other traffic, this hand cart where he found the bag too heavy to carry. He'd somehow got hold of this hand cart. He'd stop. We'd have quite a long conversation on the road like that. So that I think he was highly conscious of his own being in that way. And that was, in a way, the black bag was, in a way, a trail. It was like going to Fleet Street. And there were many things like that where you'd think he would be doing something accidentally, but he knew what he was doing every time.
There's a beautiful quote as well that I guess you published in Art Monthly, when he was talking about Yoko Ono, and he said Yoko was given 2 evenings toward the end of the month-long event. Her keenness to publicize her ideas and work meshed well with Daya's need for ongoing publicity, and the article on her in the British press assured a complete sellout of tickets.
Yeah. Well, you could go to...
Niels.
Sorry.
Niels has been waiting.
You have mentioned a lot of discussions about ideas that you had, and which importance did have religion, or the distinction between Jewishness and Christianity and Christian, and being Jewish or being Christian, for the aesthetics and for the spirituality.
We didn't discuss that. Yeah, sorry. We didn't discuss it in those terms. I remember discussing Israel with Gustav. Israel, with Gustav, I discuss it, and obviously in relation to being Jewish and what the right, I don't remember specifically, but it would correspond to saying that a lot of Israeli writers and Jewish writers had said that Israel would never have peace until the occupied territories were solved. Well, we talked about newspapers a lot, funnily enough, what the quality of newspapers was. Those were the discussions, and what was reported and how it, almost how it was reported. And he told me once that he liked reading the Sunday Telegraph because he thought he gave a lot of news. Well, you'd think that would be the direct opposite of Gustav's politics.
And did Kafka have any importance, Franz Kafka?
That's interesting. No, I can't remember discussing only a bit with Gustav or Kafka. Not very much, yeah. There are many things now I think I would like to have discussed with Gustav and kick myself.
I don't know if I heard correctly, but you said that he has never made an object. Is it true?
Sorry, if he what? Sorry.
That he was never produced an object.
I think he was an artist.
No, you said about Gustav Metzger that he has...
he didn't do much art. Yeah, I said it was a kind of flippant remark from which I knew there'd be an interesting answer, you know. Well, he did art really in a different way, I think. I mean, he processed his ideas not through the galleries. He obviously didn't think much of galleries. But I reckon he knew that I knew that his art was what it was, you might say.
But is it like a big change in the artist life when he became more institutionalized? Because I would like to counter him. Sorry, hello. Because you said that the commenter was only works when he was a student, but actually Tate Modern, they did 61, 62, his painting that he was, I just check on web, he was really following the some shapes of Otto, like when he was like these cuts. And then he wrote also the manifesto of auto creative art at the same time, and he produced this auto with acid works that I like the idea that the autonomous process to develop forms of art and movements beyond the artistic control and so on is from his retrospective exhibition recent. And in Tate Modern, his last show was full with 3 objects on a foundation of concrete. And there were, from my point of view, there's sculptural works as well. I mean, installations and yeah.
Yes, I know what you mean. I mean, the most extremely, now, while you were talking, it occurred to me, I once visited Victor Vasarely at home, and in his studio, I think. And we talked a bit, and then he said, go upstairs and see my work being produced. And so I knew Victor Vasarely did shapes, and he'd work 60 centimeters, a picture 60 by 60. And upstairs there was a Norwegian skillful craftsman who had a chest of drawers full of the shapes that Vasarely was using, and he'd enlarged this design to 100 centimeters by 100 centimeters and placed the things in the right place. Now, although Vasarely had very left-wing ideas and you could argue that this was an art for the masses in a way that could be reproduced in this way. This was the very opposite of Gustav's art to me. It struck me then when you were speaking that this was quite the opposite. And of course, one can one can characterize all sorts of art and artists in their different media and their different forms, and find similar social attitudes.
Soren?
Yeah, I think
Last question.
I don't know from what you're referring directly, but what I can say, I mean, there were these changes in his work, and he made paintings. Ah, yeah, but this is the liquid crystal. Yeah. I think because we talked somehow before that Gustav, on the one hand, was against scientists or anti-scientists, and then he made a lot of research and like made the installation in the laboratory in Swansea and so on, and was like a scientist working on it. So I think, but when we no, I hang a little bit, but there are a lot of things when he said, okay, maybe also when Kristine Stiles said, he lose some of his ideas of Diaz, it's maybe in the same that he gets, he said something like, when I figure out something and get in depth in this theme, and then it's enough. It's like with the liquid crystals also. Then it was good, I have it, I've done it, and go on. So maybe this is also these breaks or these changes. It's like sublimation to go to another form.
Yes,
yeah.
yes, I see.
And perhaps sublimation, because Kristine Stiles was also talking about Rauch, and this man had the question about the religious impact. So I think there's a very interesting document, Breathing Culture, where he derives on the Jewish tradition and so on.
Yes,
so I think it was very important for him having this religious background, but he was not putting it, or he was treating it in a very, very provocative way also. But not only as he was the victim of the victim, I think, in many cases.
Well, thank you, Soren. And of course, we're going to come back tomorrow, especially with you, Otto, Catherine, about Gustav's link with science and with computer science, especially. And he was very much for it, in as much as he would develop new forms and keep on experimenting. But that I will leave that to you, of course. I propose that we continue that talk over drinks now. How's that? So thank you very much, Ivor, for that. And I look forward to seeing you and all your friends that you will bring along tomorrow at 3 o'clock then. Thank you.